Good morning, everyone. It is with a great pleasure to have all of you in this room, and thanks for coming for our 5th symposium on enhancing well-being. To start with, I would like to introduce Professor Rob Duck, the Dean of our School of the Environment in the University of Dundee. He would like to welcome you and to say something about us. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Hassam. As Hassam says, I'm Rob Duck. I'm Dean of the School of the Environment. But what I'm going to have to start with, because I have my instructions, is to give you the housekeeping information. If the fire alarm sounds, it's not a practice. So get out of the building. Smoking is not permitted in the building. There are toilets available on the midpoint of each floor. And if anyone needs a first aider, you should contact reception for assistance. But we do have the Dean of the School of Nursing and Health Sciences amongst us, so I'm sure we should be all right if first aid is needed. Sorry, Margaret. It's a great privilege to be here to welcome you to this 5th symposium on enhancing well-being that Hassam Alware and his colleagues and his team have organised now over a period of a couple of years. And the theme today is enhancing well-being, inclusive community collaborative approaches to placemaking. Now, one of the key things that I'd like to say is, I'm sure many of you will have seen this. This is the university's transformation vision booklet. It's been out for quite a long time now, but one of the university's main purposes, or its main purposes, our reason for existing is simple. It's what we have always done. It is to transform lives. And I think that is really, this symposium is really at the heart of transforming lives. Nested within that key vision are a number of challenges. One of which is improving social, cultural, and physical well-being. And again, this meeting, I'm delighted that there's about 100 registered here, which is great. This meeting is again right at the very heart of that key challenge. Hassam, as you can see from the slide, has been very successful. Oh, it's gone. In getting sponsorship from a wide range of organisations, which is great, to support the proceedings today, to help fund the proceedings. And I'm sure that it's going to be an excellent meeting. There's lots of opportunities for discussions, for working in groups, and the programme, I think, is going to be a really super one. Without further ado, because time is really tight for this programme, so I'm told, I'm going to hand over now to Beverly, I think, is that right? Who's going to Hassam, and then to Beverly, who's going to chair the first session. So, welcome on behalf of the university. That's the slide I wanted. There are all your sponsors.
Thanks. Just before we start with the speakers and handing off to my colleague, Dr. Beverly, I just would like to introduce Professor Ian Cooper from Cambridge University. He just would like to say 2 or 3 minutes about your role, because you've got an important role here for the whole day. Thank you.
I'm almost here. Okay. Thank you. So, as Hassam says, you have a very important role to play today. You will have seen that this morning is crammed packed with presentations, and then this afternoon is equally crammed packed with discussion groups and plenary feedback. But we want you to play an active role this morning in the presentations. Okay. And what we want you to do is to actively listen to our speakers as they go through their presentations. We want you to answer these 3 questions. Okay? It would be useful at this point if you just took 2 things out of your delegate pack. They look very similar, so don't be confused by the difference between them, okay? There's one that's headed Aid Memoir, okay? And it has listed on it the 3 questions that we would like you to think about while you are listening to your speakers today. We'd also like you to draw on your own experience and expertise in attempting to answer them. The Aid Memoir is simply for you to make notes as we go through the morning speakers. There's a very similar one called Information Capture Sheet for Symposium Participants. This is the one where we'd like you to put down what you see as the answers to the 3 questions that we are asking you. Okay? Now, I think it's the case that we have some people who are with us this morning that need to leave us at the end of the morning or after lunch. Is there anybody in that position? Hands up, please. Just trying to see if I can recognise you all in time. Okay, I'm very keen that you should fill this form in before you leave, and I will strategically place myself by the door, trying to remember who you are, so I don't let you out until you've given it to me. Okay? So that's the first set of instructions from me this morning. I'll come back at the end of the morning and give you a briefing on what we're going to do this afternoon. Please feel free to use the Aid Memoir to make any notes against these questions while you're listening to the presentations. Please feel free to take this away with you, and indeed leave it for us if you think it would be useful to us. Please be sure to fill this in during the morning and certainly over lunchtime. We won't collect these from you until the end of the day, but please fill them in and leave them with us before you go, because we will produce a feedback report based on today's meeting, and we will use the information you give us to help us to write that report. Okay? Would you like to close my presentation now?
Everybody, my name is Dr. Beverly Searle and I will be chairing this morning's session. I'm going to start off by introducing Professor Ian Fazey, who's Ewan. Fast start, isn't it? Professor Fazey is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Environmental Change and Human Resilience here at the University of Dundee, and his research interests are in resilience, vulnerability and in the knowledge exchange process from enhancing the impacts arising from research. Ewan is going to speak to us for about 10 minutes. Can I just also say that we do have a packed programme, so could I just please encourage all of our speakers as well to just keep an eye on me, because I have got time cards as well, so just to give everybody a fair chance of fulfilling their slots. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ewan.
Great, thank you very much. It's really good to be here. Can everybody hear me without a microphone, or would you like me to have a microphone? Microphone, hands up? Okay, right, because you want the microphone? Okay, right. Are you okay? Right, good. I don't like microphones if I can get away with it, because I tend to shout and then I have real problems when I've got the microphone. Okay, great, thanks. What I thought I'd do this morning is rather than give lots of kind of case studies and things like that, I thought I'd just be sort of a little bit provocative in raising some of the kind of questions that we might be thinking about today and that we might hold in the back of our mind as we go along. Processes and well-being. So I thought I'd talk about that. This is the title of the symposium: Enhancing Well-being: Inclusive, Community, Collaborative Approaches to Placemaking. What I'm really going to focus about, is the stuff in the middle, because that's what I know most about. I don't know too much about well-being per se, and I don't really know a lot about placemaking per se either. So my background is in how we develop participatory research methods for being inclusive, for engaging, and for enhancing learning and capacity building and things like that. So I'm going to kind of focus on that sort of stuff in the middle. But before I do that, I just want to let's just kind of raise a little bit of a question, recap on some of the things that are out there about well-being in the first instance. Lots of ways of thinking, perspectives about well-being. Economic, for example, money is important in our current society. If you don't have money, it's pretty hard to feel happy, to meet the needs that you need. Sociological aspects, physical comforts, shelter, food and water, emotional needs, social support, etc. And in the sociological perspective, we often tend to focus on things like inequalities that exist and institutional systems that might limit our capacity to move towards being or having a sense of well-being. psychological happiness, for example, more complex things like self-esteem, self-worth, ability to flourish, etc. When I was sort of thinking about this, what it made me think about was also that well-being is then not just an end goal, it's also a process. Do we ever really sort of meet or achieve well-being in some sense, or is it actually part of a longer-term process over time that happens in some kind of form? So that kind of got me thinking. So this notion of process is kind of important, possibly even to the concept of well-being. What we do know, though, is that the process in which we try to enhance people's well-being really does matter. How we do it really matters. The classic example in sort of participatory or not doing participatory kind of approaches, if you like, goes back into the 60s and 70s in the Green Revolution in India. It's a kind of classic case of kind of success but not success. At that time, in the early 1960s, India was importing a huge amount of food, and they just couldn't sustain the population. So they went through a couple of decades of massive kind of scientific, technological, food intensification growth in order to achieve that amongst a whole range of sort of pricing policies and so on. Success? Were they really successful? Well, at one level, at one measure of success, by the sort of end of the 1970s, they didn't have to import any food grains, despite severe droughts. So they were producing lots and lots more food as a result. But what also happened in that sort of period is those in extreme poverty increased dramatically, 38 to 53%. The landlessness of the poor increased dramatically from 20 to 50%. So what was going on? Well, essentially the whole assumption behind the Green Revolution was that the assumption was that there would be a trickle-down effect. So you work in the communities with those who already have the capacity to get the technologies going that then enhanced and that was supposed to trickle down to all the others that perhaps had less capacity in the first place. But the problem with that is that didn't work at all. What it did was it enhanced the position of those who already had the capacity to be able to generate income, which allowed them to buy up the land of those who needed to sell the land to get the income to survive. So that's dramatically increased the inequalities. And that's a really key message, because that tells us that how we go about doing it is really important. In process then, in sort of 80s and 90s, there was a kind of start towards a shift towards much more participatory engagement in international development, popularised by people like Robert Chambers. That's a really classic book that is still very pertinent today about how we engage with people. So the process, when we're talking about inclusive, community, collaborative, is often really about learning and capacity empowerment. This is one definition of community participation, basically allowing people to have some input into the direction of their development or enhancing their well-being, but again going into this process thing that well-being is actually part of a process too. And I think really for me, and it might mean differently for you, but I see it as enhancing learning and the handing over the learning to others, the ownership responsibility, building capacity, and empowering in terms of changing the relations between different actors in the process as well, and trying to enhance that. And that is a key part of participatory processes. Many of you will have come across this. This is from the late 60s, actually. This is Arnstein's ladder of participation, just sort of showing the different levels of kinds of engagement and the extent to which they're moving towards higher degrees of autonomy, participation, and so on. So at the bottom, you've got really non-participation, rubber stamping, letting off steam, allowing people to come into a room to shout that they kind of about what they need, but not really doing anything with it, all the way up to sort of citizens' power kind of ideas where you're getting much more degrees of autonomy of communities that are involved. And that still kind of is important for us to think today, because it's the process of how you go about doing things that effectively delivers that. And we know that this kind of stuff matters. It does make an impact. This is just some data from a former PhD student of mine, and she was looking at environmental conservation projects. She basically compared 3 levels of projects. at the low levels of participation, where it was kind of like a citizen science. People go along and they do a bit of a survey or set some traps for some invasive species or something like that. They'd be kind of part of that, but they didn't really have much say in the kind of direction of how the project was going or making real decisions about it. At the other end of the scale, you had volunteer projects that were literally set up and run by volunteers. They were running the whole projects themselves, making the decisions and being really key in part of the process of delivering it. And what basically this graph shows is you've got the dark colours are the low participation, the white colour is the high participation grade in the middle. And these are just different kind of things about learning. What different kinds of learning people achieved in the process. So learning something new, recognising viewpoints of others, etc. And the results are incredibly stark. So this is a survey of 300 people from 8 different projects, incredibly stark. If you've got higher participation, you've got much higher amounts of learning. You don't even need stats to show that there's a difference there. So it's really kind of interesting, you start seeing these impacts when you get different levels of participation. Similar work we've done in the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific, bringing communities together, helping them establish their own community-based organisation that's trying to work across multiple communities. And we used very, very intensive participatory approaches. The big mantra I went in was saying, I'm not going to say anything unless it's asking a question. I only ask questions. And they would rattle their brains and tell us what to do. It's like, I'm not telling you what to do at all. You've got to, it's about you building your ability to do it. And their levels of confidence in their own knowledge and the importance of their own knowledge and being able to challenge others who came in outside and saying, yeah, but we know what we're talking about, was really critical. And that in itself was a really key success. But there are lots of criticisms about participatory processes as well, and it's worth thinking about these. And these are just some of them. Privilege is the public domain. Do people work and operate the same in a big public space? Are some voices less likely to be heard in those spaces than others? Is that really what we're trying to do, or is it kind of just, again, playing around with the power relations and the dynamics that might be in the room? Welcome. You coming in? No? Okay. Localism is another thing. Is that always good? If a decision is made at a local level, it may not be good for society as a whole, for example. So that's one of the kind of key challenges. Particularly difficult when we're talking about environmental issues. It's very difficult to get local decisions that are good for society as a whole in terms of environment. It's sometimes very difficult to do that. Power is often held by the facilitating organisations. That's often mostly us in the room. We tend to be the ones that are setting the projects up or designing the facilitation, but we're making a priori decisions about what's important even before we start that process. So what does that tell us about the process? Is that really empowerment? Another criticism, participatory approaches can raise expectations that can't easily be met. Go back to the work we did in the Solomon Islands. We got a long way forward, we set up a set of projects afterwards, but their levels of capacity to deal with the challenges that they had to face were just not there. It needed a much greater degree of sort of capacity building and was very difficult. And as a result, these participatory processes can also be quite damaging if they're not done well. You can end up with mistrust, you can end up with a sense of failure, or it's very difficult to do that. So you have to think very long term as you go about these sort of things. And there's lots of subtle impacts of participation. There's a really good example of this from India from the 1990s, and it was called the Employment Assurance Scheme. And it was distributed around a range of districts in India, started in 1993. And the aim was really to develop infrastructure, but it was also to give work to the poor, and it had some great elements in it. Okay, so it had some really good elements. First of all, it was grassroots. It was very much driven, the projects were supposed to be driven by the local communities themselves. They decided what projects are needed, then they were basically given some finance to pay people to do that work. It was demand-led. The poor were supposed to be able to demand work if they needed it. And this was particularly important for many of the people involved because in certain periods of the year, there wasn't any agricultural work for them, so they didn't get enough food, they didn't have enough income. So being able to demand work at certain periods was really important. And it was self-selecting of the poor. These weren't big, highly paid projects, so it was likely not to attract those who had lots of money already. So the aim was to empower communities to be able to kind of pull themselves out of poverty and start challenging some of the relationships between community and some of the state organisations involved. That was the aim. Now, To explain the outcome of it, I need to give you a little bit more detail about the poor themselves in this particular place. I won't be able to go into too much detail, but basically they were facing insecure livelihoods. As I said, certain times of the year, very difficult for them to get enough food or income to buy food. Very much faced by prejudice and social exclusion, partly due to the caste system that was there, but basically people looked down on certain sectors of society, particularly the poor, because of the nature of their indigenous sort of nature and so on. And they were much less powerful. They relied very heavily on their relationship with their employers for parts of the year that they got employed, because they had to borrow money from them at that time when they didn't have work, so that they could keep going at a later stage. They relied on their friends and neighbours to a high degree, but these were also poor. And most important, they relied on these kind of middlemen who kind of negotiated between the poor and the more powerful in society to help them, kind of like these political activists that helped that negotiation. So was this successful? Did it work? Well, it was successful at one level. We had, those who attended the public meetings to decide what projects would be delivered. It had very high kind of participation of the poor. They were at the meetings. And those who got work tended to be the poor. So great, that looks pretty good. The poor are getting the work. But it's a little bit more complex than that. When they were in the meetings, those who were poor were very passive. They didn't say anything. And they weren't aware that actually they could demand work. They didn't realise that that was actually a key part of it. So what was going on? Well, actually what was happening is these middlemen, at one level, they were dependent on this relationship between the poor and the more powerful members in society. So what that happened is that this project was effectively enabling the poor to bypass them. So they downplayed this demand-led aspect of it because it was actually in their interest to do so. And the poor didn't want to challenge people's positions. In the same room were the guys that they were dependent on at all sorts of times of year. So they're not going to stand up and say something different about what they wanted. So there are lots of subtle things going on in there that you couldn't really see. So at one level, this project was good because it achieved the outcomes, but it wasn't achieving this change in the power relations between local, state, and different things that were happening in there. So it wasn't really achieving what participation might be really trying to achieve to address real underlying issues. So all these criticisms depend really on how you look at participation. And there's two kind of key ways of thinking about it. You could see participation as a means to an end. So if, let's say I go into a community and I've already decided we want a hospital, right? I want to go in this community. Well, let's use participation to decide how big the hospital bit is, where's it going to be, what's it going to look like, and so on. And you could use participation, it would greatly enhance the efficiency and the output of that project and that product. Fantastic, great. But if I do that, I'm not really focusing on this changing the underlying power relations between what's going on necessarily. The other way of thinking about it is that you could see participation and engagement as kind of an end in itself. It's kind of like, has its own kind of empowerment kind of outcomes. And when you do that, effectively, in the case of the hospital, you might go in and say, what do you need, rather than assuming that they need a hospital in the first place. Maybe a school is what they need. And you start from that kind of sort of space. And what you're doing there is really focusing much more on empowering communities to make better decisions, take control, responsibility, and so on. It's quite a different way of approaching things. And the argument is that if you do that, you're much more likely to take into account these kind of different power relations that are going on in different kind of settings and circumstances. So it's kind of key to be thinking quite deeply about what it is you're actually trying to achieve in these processes. And really finally, I think what we're talking about partly is that particularly perhaps when we talk about placemaking, and I don't know a lot about placemaking or planning particularly, but I'm assuming if you get people involved in planning, you're actually creating a space that might change their future, that could have a much kind of longer term effect. I wonder whether it's really starting to change this relationship or not, and many of you would know have a better understanding of it than I would. But if you're starting to change planning at community level, is it really starting to shift this relationship between the two? Many projects work at participation at here, but they don't address this bit of the relationship as well. So you have to think of participation at this kind of level, encompassing all of those things too. We've got a project that's literally just started this week, or last week, and it's called the Scottish Borders Climate Resilient Communities. We're working in collaboration with the Scottish Borders Council and a whole range of other people. It's Joseph Rowntree funded project looking at climate disadvantaged people and trying to think about how we build the resilience around that. But one of the key things we're trying to do there is create a space that allows the council to step out of their perceived role of authority and actually start to work collaboratively in a facilitated space with the community. So we try and start flattening, if you like, the hierarchies between the two and start trying to kind of reshape that in a new collaborative kind of agenda. We're doing lots of other things around it as well, but effectively that's one of the things we're trying to do in that project. So really that's all I'm going to say in detail, but it does raise a whole range of questions that I think are very pertinent to what we're talking about today. So is well-being a process or an end goal? What does that mean? Is participation a means to an end or an end in itself? What does that mean? How does empowerment contribute to well-being? What's the kind of relationship between being empowered and feeling a greater sense of well-being? Is that really important? How can wider things like environmental goals be achieved through participation? What are the non-local things that we need to achieve that might need to be achieved through local interaction? Is placemaking any different from other participatory processes? Is there something specific about placemaking and its engagement with planning that really kind of takes us beyond just sort of superficial participation? And how can empowerment be achieved in collaboration between authorities and communities? So those are some of the questions that kind of raise up in my mind. I'm sure you'll have many as well. But thank you very much.
Okay, so just while we're switching over then, our next speaker this morning is going to be Mr. Sandy Robinson, who is the Principal Architect of the Scottish Government. Sandy heads up the Architecture branch within the Planning and Architecture Division of the Scottish Government, and has led on the development and implementation of a number of Scottish Government initiatives, which includes the Charette Mainstream, which I think most of you will be familiar with, and the development of a place standard as well.
Okay, good morning. If people hear me similarly, I prefer to not use the microphone if possible, but just let me know if you're struggling to hear me and I'll pick it up. I think today is a really useful opportunity for me. I think the questions that have been posed are very interesting, and I have to admit, first thing in the morning, I don't have the answers to them, or probably not even close. And so what I'll try and do, I think, is plot a line from some very high-level strategic objectives of Scottish Government down through to some practical initiatives that we think are starting to occupy this sort of space about collaboration and the impact it has on well-being. And in terms of well-being, I'll probably focus more on the health and well-being side of it, principally because we're doing quite a lot of work on that because the evidence base is quite strong. A lot of what I'll present, I think many people here will be familiar with, so indulge me a little bit on that. So we'll start right at the top level. This is the programme for government for Scottish Government, and I think it really has signalled a shift, fundamental shift in some of the priorities of ministers. I know a lot of people previously are aware that the purpose of the Scottish Government is to increase sustainable economic growth, and that really is that's still fundamentally the aim of government, and prosperity is how that's picked up in the current programme for government. But fairness, which is really about reducing inequalities, and that can be any inequalities, income inequality, social inequalities generally, and health inequalities in particular, is very important to the current First Minister and to the government as a whole. And participation, for a number of reasons. We have a government who feels that decisions are best made by people who are closest to them, but also there's no doubt that what happened last year in terms of the referendum really stirred up a lot of interest in what communities can do, the level of interest that people have for their environment. I just turn the projector off. And the Scottish model for policy development, I understand this is probably a bit dull for some people, is really focused on these three key areas. Person-centred, so it is about the quality of life for people, asset-based, and that can be physical assets, service assets, I think there's a lot of focus on that, but also knowledge as an asset, and co-production, I think, is seen as a vital way of bringing some of these assets together too. So quickly, I suppose, a little bit about some of the stuff which I think planning and placemaking has dealt with over quite a long period of time in relation to health and well-being, and that's mostly about physical activity. So physical inactivity, fourth leading risk factor for global mortality, and the estimates of the cost of that to Scotland are absolutely huge. And yet we know that 20% of people walk for 20 minutes less than once a year or never. So 1/5 of the population are never walking for a period of 20 minutes, probably at all. And a lot of that is because of the patterns and lifestyle that we live, which is determined by the physical environment too. The benefits of taking these regular, moderate exercise, we know, are very great. It's not just to do with being sort of fit in terms of cardiovascular fitness, chronic and acute diseases, diabetes, cancer, dementia, there are significant benefits here. And again, the physical environment and placemaking can contribute a lot to that. Some streets are designed for people to walk and not cars, and people are 25% more likely to walk to work. Here we have a big opportunity. Similarly, nearly 80% of journeys under 1 mile are made on foot. So that's telling us something about design outcomes, about places, once they're delivered, places in which we live, we work, etc., and how they can help to support health and well-being outcomes. But I think what's probably more interesting to talk about certainly today is actually about the design process itself and how that can empower people and how that empowerment and sense of control can contribute to health and well-being outcomes as well. So this idea of process that you must talk about is really interesting and something we're particularly keen on. So Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer at the Scottish Government, I'll rely on a lot of Sir Harry Burns' material in this presentation, but he said the fundamental problem about Scotland's poor health is the health of the poor. The great recognition that inequalities across Scotland, particularly in terms of income inequality, have a big relationship to health and well-being outcomes. And as much as you think this image might have some pedestrian priority and green space in it, actually it's a pretty desolate scene. It's a type of scenario which many communities in Scotland have to live with on a daily basis, and it has health impacts. Places which you would consider potentially to be assets for places become suddenly deficits in terms of the perception communities have of their own abilities to thrive, to flourish, to have some economic activity, but even on a personal level too, about how it makes you feel as an individual and how that influences your health outcomes too. And some of these inequalities are quite stark. You know, we can see somebody, a young person, engaging in physical activity, which you know is good for them, but clearly there's a greater benefit to doing it in a social environment, in a more pleasant environment, and to doing it by yourself, and in a place which is very alien to you. Fundamentally, something is different is happening to that individual. And so that's really what I kind of want to talk about, is a sense of coherence and having personal resilience. And particularly there's a lot of importance about early years conditioning here too. But from a wider sort of social sense, the physical environment has a big impact on our personal resilience and our ability to make sense of the world. So this is an American medical sociologist, Aaron Antonovsky, and he really underpinned a lot of the work that Sir Harry Burns did in his time as Chief Medical Officer. And what he said is that our lives need to be comprehensible, manageable and meaningful, or we experience a state of chronic stress. So the world has to make some kind of sense to us. We need to feel that we can contribute to it, that we are part of it, or we experience chronic stress. And chronic stress is linked to early mortality. So how you feel on a daily basis, on an ongoing basis, not these peaks and spikes of stress, but actually your baseline level of stress is influenced by your ability to make sense of the world too. And that has a physical impact on your biology. So what Harry Burns said is the biology is very clear. So chaotic, difficult circumstances lead to increased risk of physical ill health. There's clearly a role there for the built environment in terms of its physical perception. But as I say, what's interesting is how you help to create and modify the built environment. And let's not spend a fortune trying to find solutions to change that, but let's change the difficult circumstances themselves. predicated on salutogenesis as opposed to pathogenesis, which is really the study of ill health. Salutogenesis is about creating the conditions for health. So your environment and your perception allowing you to live in a healthy way, and it's not about the absence of disease, but of the presence of health itself. And that circumstances can be noise to you, that if you don't have a sense of control, that your environment is actually confusing, and you cease to accept that as information that you can deal with. That then has an impact on your mental well-being and subsequently your physical health. And developing meaning, connection, control with the physical and social environment is key to overcoming that. So what I kind of wanted to talk about today in a bit more detail is co-production, and giving one example where we feel there's an opportunity to pursue a co-production agenda on placemaking, and that's to talk about charrettes. And I know many of you will be familiar with charrettes, but I'll run through why we're involved in them and what we think they can realise in terms of their potential. So, but the benefits of co-production are to actually involve people in the design of their services. There's a lot of that going on in the public sector, a lot of that happening in the health and social care environment. But by involving people in the design of service delivery or of placemaking, you give them a role, you give them some control over their environment, you can empower them, you can give them confidence, you can also importantly build networks and relationships between communities. So charrettes, what is a charrette? And they will be familiar to many of you, but what I'll talk about is how the Scottish Government sees charrettes, because we certainly we don't think that the only way of public participation in planning. There's no method of it, but similarly, lots of people have different approaches to delivering charrettes. But fundamentally, they are about getting everybody together to design something, and the fact that it's a design process is absolutely crucial to us. So rather than going around the houses and consulting people individually, it's about the creative environment taking place with everybody who has a stake within it. So the communities, key agencies, the local authority, government come together to make these decisions together. And from our perspective, it's not a consultation process that uses design. It's the opposite. It is a design process that is consultative. And I think it's this idea about the process itself and that people are involved in it, that adds value to it. So it's the sum is very much more than, the whole is very much more than the sum of the parts. If you're an architect, a planner, or who's an engineer, then I apologise, I'm an architect. But here we have the architect who presents his plans, which he has worked on diligently for some time. He thinks are fantastic. Says to the community who have had absolutely no stake in this at all just now, what do they think about? There's generally a bad reaction about these sort of things. People are frightened of new development, don't understand what it means, but they have no stake in it at all. So you speak to the planning authority as well, and quite often you get quite a processy answer in these instances. You speak to the roads department, and they often have a strong view about these sort of things too. But the point is that it's not collaboration really at all here. What it is that it's objects which are hitting off each other too. So bringing people together to design these things in a single environment, it has some benefits too. Importantly, it's not about asking people what they want. It's not about raising aspirations too high, although that is a real danger. It's about asking people what they know and then plugging that information in a way that makes sense with design skills into the process. It's not about the collection of facts either. It's not something which you can do by a questionnaire. It's about the application of knowledge. And there's something in there about actually having the physical relationship with somebody and being able to exchange information and generate knowledge through that process itself. The way in which they work, they take place within communities themselves. They take place on site. So it involves walkabouts with the community, site tours, getting out, speaking to people, hard to reach groups, people who ordinarily might not turn up to the back of the community hall to look at the presentations. And very often these people have got really important views. They don't want to turn up to a public consultation event because they may be jaded, they don't feel it is for them, but allowing them to input into the process enriches that process, but it empowers them to. So there are presentations, there's importantly design working, so it's not consultation, as I say, it's the process itself. You typically might ask the community to feed back to themselves, to start that dialogue, to start that sort of process of increasing networks. This is Shirley, this is down in Girvan. She's a pretty serious person. If she stands up and tells you what she thinks about her community, you really listen to Shirley, believe you me. The design studio itself is established on site, so it's not remote working, it's about bringing people together. And then the outputs too, highly graphic. They really need to be outputs that the communities can engage with at the event. It's not about developing a wish list or a set of practical objectives. It's about the place and making sure that people can understand it too. So plans, sketches, if there are time, and there's often 3D visualizations put together. I think this is what's interesting from our perspective at the moment in terms of where we see charrettes going, is that we have been handling them primarily as a planning process, as a way to increase efficiency, engagement, which we want to increase within the planning system, and increase design quality as well by bringing designers in at an early stage. And that's still a key objective. But I think one of the areas we're keener to exploit is that this is the potential first step in actually involving people in the delivery of the outcomes of charrettes too. So helping to build those networks early on, where people contribute to the plans, but then also they move forward into delivering the outcomes of it too. That involves some resource. A lot of it is time and energy. There's no getting away from it, but some of it will be money. And there's an element of risk of passing things across to groups who haven't delivered these sort of things before. But the benefits, potentially, are that over a generational period, people will have a more informed dialogue and debate about their environment. They'll come together. The communities themselves will become more diverse, richer, and stronger. And that co-production will start to gain momentum, and will therefore have health benefits and well-being benefits for people. Benefits that you can see quite early on in terms of things like town centre regeneration, and half of our charrette programme has focused on town centres because we know that they're important places for communities. The other half is focused on longer term development planning objectives too. I think where we're probably likely to go with the charrette programme is focusing much more actually on the delivery, on pushing this as a co-production model, about speaking to other parts of government who have funding and saying, can you come along to the charrette too and make sure that the outputs of this have a future, and that communities know that they have a pot of money or they have some source of support to take the outcomes of the charrette forward. So it's this idea about the design process being the mechanism to help generate the health and well-being outcomes too. The places which are delivered may well be healthy places that encourage active travel, etc. But bringing people together is key to empower them to see the benefits of health and well-being in that regard. And really this is the question that I think we're pondering in government about what we're doing with charrettes, but it's something I think is really cool to reflect on today if we can too. Is that are we missing the potential of the collaborative process that we have in planning to actually help create health and not just create places themselves? And just to finish off too, this is about the raising expectations danger, which is often a problem when you come to charrettes or any engagement, is that expectations of communities are much higher than they might ordinarily have been. They get very excited at charrettes, it's like a bit of a party, but there's an inevitable hangover afterwards where the dust settles and perhaps the action on the ground doesn't live up to expectations. But the danger of not actually aiming high is mediocrity, and it's not moving forward, and it's not bringing people into the heart of the process too. So I would suggest that we continue to aim high and we raise the bar as high as we possibly manage. That's all I was going to say.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Okay, so we'll move on to our next speaker now, who is Dr. Roy Mitchell from NHS Scotland. He joined NHS Scotland in 2008 as part of the Public Health Observatory team. His current role as a Good Places Better Health Information Strategy Leader focuses on place and health with an emphasis on health inequalities. He's currently leading Health Scotland's input to the development of a place standard for Scotland.
Thank you very much. I'll also attempt to speak without a microphone, but again, please let me know if you need me to pick it up to be a little bit clearer. So the title of my presentation today is Good Places Better Health. Many of you will know that this is the Scottish Government initiative. It was launched in 2008 as the Scottish Government's Environment and Health Strategy. I'll talk a little bit about Good Places Better Health, the initiative, but I'm going to use the title more broadly and talk about this idea of creating better health through good places. So I'll talk about well-being, that being the theme of the day, about community involvement, and of course place. I'll also talk quite a lot actually about health inequalities. We've heard a little bit about health inequalities already, but obviously it's a focus of my work and my organisation, but I think it's absolutely fundamental to the agenda of working with communities and placemaking and enhancing well-being. So I'll try and explore that just a little bit more. I've covered some of this already. I'll talk about health, well-being, inequalities, role of place, role of communities. I'll go on to say a little bit about Good Places Better Health and a little bit more about the place standard. So, well-being. We could probably have another entire symposium about what well-being means, how you measure it, what it means to people. I'm not going to say very much about it at all, but I did want to just draw attention to one thing, which is the WHO's definition of health. What do we mean by health? A state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And I think that's a very important definition, and is often lost in a lot of discussions within health and perhaps in the way that the sort of health perspective is perceived. It's interesting as well that this sounds like a bold 21st century definition of health. This is actually the definition that has been around since shortly after the Second World War. So when I talk about the benefits, the health benefits of placemaking, I'm talking about it much more broadly. This idea of it being all about physical, mental, and social well-being. So health inequalities then. Obviously very high up the political agenda. We've heard a little bit already about why that is. Scotland has a massive challenge in terms of health inequalities. And this is just one illustration. You'll probably be familiar with this kind of thing through the media, if not through professional work. This is a tube map of Glasgow, and it shows how if you just go a few stops along the central line, male life expectancy in the area that you are drops by about 14 years. So it's really quite a stark difference. Where you are, where you are born, where you live really matters in terms of health outcomes. This illustration is the other end of the life course. This is based on a strengths and difficulties assessment of children. And so it shows the inequalities gradient. On the left here we've got the most deprived and a much higher percentage of difficulties, and a very steep gradient down to the low percentage you see in the least deprived there on the right. And the purpose of this illustration is really just to show that I could have used any number of illustrations, but essentially however you define health and well-being, whatever you want to look at, when you look at the data, this is the kind of thing you see, and this is why it's really important. Scotland has good health and well-being. It's just not equally shared, and the opportunities for health and well-being are not equally shared. So what causes health inequalities? Well, health inequalities are the result of a causal chain which begins over here with fundamental causes, the global forces, the political priorities, societal values, which lead to the unequal distribution of power, money and resources. Those fundamental causes shape the environment that we experience and the environmental influences on our lives, and that shapes individual experiences in terms of economic, work, social and cultural experiences. and ultimately, we see the effects. We see these very stark inequalities. And I think this model is interesting today for two reasons. First of all, it shows the environment and the influence of the environment very much as a central part of this causal chain. But it also talks about, as a fundamental cause, the unequal distribution of power, money, and resources. And the power element of that is, I think, particularly interesting. There are various forms of power, but one form of power is being involved, being able to participate in decision making. And that is important, as Sandy's already alluded to, in terms of people's health and well-being, the sense of control that they have over their lives. So, probably not necessary to define place, but I quite like this definition. This is from Good Places Better Health, the term used to bring together the social, economic, physical, cultural, and historical characteristics of a location. And I've said a bit already about place and health inequalities. And again, as Sandy said, the inequalities can be really quite striking in terms of looking at the environment in which we live. This is just one simple illustration. Again, the most deprived is on the left, the least deprived on the right. And again, you see a gradient. This relates to whether people feel safe walking in their neighbourhood alone after dark. And I can provide many other illustrations of this as well, but to a large extent it's not necessary. We know that there are massive inequalities, massive differences in places. It's evident just walking through the city, and it's a large part of the reason that we're here today to discuss enhancing well-being. I'm not going to talk a lot about the detail of community collaboration and the processes involved. It's not really my area of expertise. And what I wanted to emphasise is really the momentum that is behind this whole agenda from a health perspective, as well as from other directions. This summarises it quite nicely, I think. This is actually the front cover of the Poverty and Truth Commission from a few years ago. Nothing about us without us is for us. And this has actually become really quite embedded in the discourse around health inequalities. And you know, over the last few years, a lot of meetings I've gone to, people raise this issue, but make this point about the need to work with communities rather than doing things to communities. And that's reflected in a wide variety of documents and policies, etc. I won't talk through all of these quotes, but Health Scotland, in their policy review on health inequalities, talk about targeting initiatives, so working with people rather than targeting initiatives at them. Good Places Better Health talks about empowering local people to have a genuine influence over decisions that affect their neighbourhood. The Go Well Regeneration project, a slightly different take on this, but it looked at empowerment and found various forms of empowerment to be associated with mental well-being, including being involved in decision-making, being consulted, being able to take action collectively or individually or with others. And of course, we've got the context provided by the Christie Commission and so on, a recognition that there needs to be a change in the way that public services are designed and delivered. So there's a lot of momentum around this, and I think there's a real opportunity to try and bring together the different strands of, and try to make a difference. So I've covered well-being, place, community, inequalities, and hopefully try to sort of paint that as one big picture. So what are we doing about it? What I'm going to focus on in the second half of my talk is a couple of national initiatives which I'm involved in, Good Places Better Health and the Place Standard for Scotland. And if you indulge me for a second, I'd be really interested to know, just by a show of hands, how many people are aware of the Place Standard and know that it's currently being developed. It's most people, but by no means all. Thanks, that's helpful. So, a brief history. The Place Standard has developed from a number of different directions, but one of them was Good Places Better Health. Good Places Better Health had a prototype phase which focused on children's health, and it led to the development of a set of recommendations, 10 recommendations, the very first of which was, we wish to see a Scotland where a neighbourhood quality standard is used as standard for neighbourhood asset development. So that's a good place of better health. In parallel to that, the policy statement from Architecture in Place, the government came out with creating places, which included a commitment to develop a place standard assessment tool that will address quality in relation to places and support healthy and sustainable lifestyles. So the goals of these are obviously very close, and so it made a lot of sense to create one fused project, which is ongoing and is led in partnership with Scottish Government, NHS Health Scotland, Architecture and Design Scotland, and it's developing a place standard which will work for existing communities, thinking about community-led change and involvement in communities and, as their places evolve, and also regeneration and also new developments. So it's quite an ambitious and challenging piece of work. The purpose is to support the delivery of high-quality places in Scotland and maximise the potential of the physical and social environment in supporting health, well-being and a high quality of life. And I just wanted to emphasise one thing through one of the objectives, that what this is really all about is providing a framework for structured conversations, and people and communities are absolutely at the centre of that. It's about supporting communities to work with others who have a responsibility for a place or a stake in a place, and deliver high quality places together. So it's about supporting public sector, private sector and communities to work together to take the action to generate the outcomes, to design the develop the places that we want to see. Throughout the course of developing this work, we've kept a focus on people's experience of a place, and what is it about the place that matters to people, what is it that affects their health and well-being. And these are a few examples, but there's obviously a great deal to consider. What we've tried to do is to distill this down into a set of themes, and we came up with 14 themes which are arranged around a circle which we're calling a compass. They're framed as questions because the whole purpose is to try and get people talking about place, talking about the right things, and questions are a good way of doing that. Now, I don't have time at the moment to talk through the 14 themes. It's also worth noting that this has gone out to consultation, so the themes are likely to change, the number of themes is likely to change as well. What I wanted just to highlight is that one of the themes is about engaged communities. So as well as being central to the overall way that the place standard will operate in terms of structuring conversations and getting people working together, it will also ask people with an interest in a place to consider this question. Are communities engaged? Are people able to participate in making their neighbourhood as good as it can be? Another theme that's important is community identity and sense of belonging. And so these have an equal place sitting alongside more themes that are more to do with the physical infrastructure, thinking of green space and public transport, maintenance, parking, etc. So participation and identity, sense of belonging are very much part of that. As I've said, what this is all about is structuring conversations, so each of these themes becomes part of a bigger conversation. And those conversations can take place within communities and with others in a stake in a place, and multiple conversations about the same place are all equally valid. And one important element is that as well as structuring the conversations, it will lead to the generation of an output, a sort of visual assessment, which is essentially a spider diagram. And again, in the interest of time, I won't go into how all of this works, but it's a visual assessment of a place along these themes, and it gives an impression very quickly of where the priorities might lie. And the idea is that this isn't an output in itself, it's not a definitive judgment or measurement of a place, but this output becomes part of the conversation. You can look at it, you can compare it with other diagrams that have been produced for the same place, and it's intended to contribute to that conversation. So what's happening with the place standard is an ongoing program of stakeholder engagement, testing and piloting, and the place standard will be published later this year. But that's by no means the sort of end point. There'll be an implementation phase, we'll look towards evaluation, and it should become part of the sort of plan, do, study, act cycle, where the place standard is improved in the way that it works, is enhanced as we go along and learn more about it. That's all I want to say on the place standard. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'll come back to this question of enhancing well-being and how we do that through action on place, given that going for a walk in the care rooms isn't always going to be the answer. I've got my next couple of slides are actually just the questions that have been posed for today, and rather than try and answer them, because I certainly don't have all the answers, I'll just move through to my conclusions and touch on some of them on the way. So in conclusion, enhancing well-being, tackling health inequalities are effectively the same agenda. And I would say that community collaboration has a very important role to play, but that role is making a contribution as part of an integrated approach, a wider approach which has to look at the whole causal chain that leads to the inequalities that we see. So the political, economic and social context in which this takes place is obviously very important. There's a lot of big things going on that relate to that causal chain. I'm thinking of austerity and cuts to housing benefits, etc. These are all massively important to people and are sort of have to be part of the picture as well. But community collaboration and placemaking together have an important role to play. Inclusion and representativeness are absolutely key. We've heard some of these issues being raised already. But I've talked about health inequalities in terms of a sort of outcome that we're trying to influence, but they're important in terms of the process as well. We have to ask the question, which communities are we engaging with? Which communities are having the biggest voice? Is it the people who are most in need, or is it the communities where we already have a certain amount of power, who are able to sort of shout the loudest? And this is a challenge that we're facing with the place standard as well. How do we ensure that it's actually used to the benefit of the right communities? And the same question applies within communities in terms of representativeness and inclusion. Is it the people who are most disempowered who will ultimately benefit from these processes? And these are hugely important questions, because in terms of health inequalities, there's a really big opportunity here to make this contribution to tackling health inequalities. If we get it right. If we get it wrong, it will actually increase health inequalities. And so there's an opportunity and a challenge. There needs to be an ongoing process of learning and sharing of information to maximise the impact of of the actions that communities and professionals can take together. Not just see that it happens, but actually see make sure that the impact is optimised. And again, the place standard should be part of this. The place standard tries to use what we know already and put some of it into practice. But we need to recognise as well that we still need to learn along the way about how to implement it, how it all works, how to generate the outcomes that we all want to see. And lastly, just to emphasise that the place standard for Scotland is an opportunity to push this agenda forward. So that's all that I want to say. A few acknowledgements up here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Rory. We've got our final speaker this morning is Professor Kevin Murray. Kevin is a chartered town planner with 30 years' experience. He is a founding member of the Urban Design Alliance and founding director of the Academy of Urbanism. He served as an advisor to the UK government departments and devolved administration, and has contributed to several BBC radio and TV programmes. And we'll just get Kevin's presentation loaded. After Kevin, we're going to have Mr. Eric Dawson is also going to speak to us for a few minutes as well. And then there'll be an opportunity for us to open it up, and you will have plenty of chance for you to raise any questions or concerns that you have at that point.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back in Dundee University on such a sunny day. I came back from Germany yesterday and I was expecting lots of rain. So this is a hugely important topic that's valid not just here in Scotland but around the world at the moment. And it's being discussed not only in universities and the health sector, but it's being discussed in planning departments and city mayors and so on. And what I want to flag up is that one of the big conversions of particularly urbanists, but also health professionals around this, is in Birmingham next month. And you'll see that at this Congress, which is the Academy of Urbanism Congress, people like Charles Montgomery, the author of Happy City, he's based in Vancouver, he'll be talking at it along with a number of other people like the HS2 design panelist, Sadie Morgan, who's exploring the placemaking dimension of big infrastructure. And others like Stephen Willesee, who in looking at the policy implementation of placemaking in Aarhus in Denmark are using the theme Happy City. Not just basic well-being and health, actually happiness is a big part of the policy program there. So we've got some really interesting people, so if you're interested in this theme and would like to participate more, please come along to the Birmingham Congress, where we will also be announcing the next stage of the Urbanism Awards, where I think Broughty Ferry was a finalist last year in the neighbourhood category, and I think Perth is up for the kind of town level category, and may get through to the next level. So they all get announced, and they get visits like that group there. Now, we've all mentioned the framing questions, one because we've been advised, stick to the question, stick to the issue, and I'm going to depart from them for a little bit, but come back to them, because I am going to make an attempt to respond. So I'm not ignoring them, but I'll just pass on them for now. Design matters in relation to better health and well-being. So if we think about it, I'm coming from a planning, urbanism, urban design perspective, connecting to health and well-being rather than the other end. But it's hugely important, and it has always been part of the philosophy and ethos of town planning since the beginning. Remember, a lot of the early British and even international German town planning came from a basis of public health. How do we address that in terms of what we provide? Our response in the 20s and 30s was that. Our later response was that. We have been pulling those down all around Glasgow, for instance, and other cities around Europe, and we're left with that. Now, how do we deal with that in terms of the quality environment that people have as an experiential place? Because as we've reduced the density, we have often lost the schools, the shops, the local services that were in those neighbourhoods or precincts, whether they are Victorian, Edwardian, or mid-20th century. Now, that's not just us, that's happening around Paris, around Bratislava, around all sorts of places in the world where we're changing places. We have a very progressive approach to policy in Scotland, where we have tried to link some of these strands. Those are just a number, and as Sandy has intimated, more are coming out. And we have been influenced by various people trying to address this, but often we've had to default in the planning and design world to more planning and design, because that's what we sell, that's what we make. That's our experience, it's what we learn at university, it's what we practice in our local authority departments and consultancies. But as we heard earlier, Harry Burns raised questions not simply from the health sector, but of us in planning and placemaking and architecture, saying, is this response of selective clearance, public art, a bit of greening, is that enough? Does that enhance the quality of life that people require? And yes, he referred to Aaron Antonovsky. You've heard about him, but I'm not going to repeat it other than to say salutogenesis. Yes, we picked it up. It's a message. It's part of our vocabulary now, even though it's a hard word to use. And say we don't use it in reports very much. But the bit about comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful is very important. not simply in the plans, but in the processes that we undertake to make those plans and hopefully deliver on them. And without the dialogue and discourse that we have with communities, with stakeholders, often with businesses, and even across the policymaker spectrum, we can't build up this engaged, informed society we need to make decisions. Now, the difficulty is that the context for this is becoming ever more complex. We're living longer, which creates a whole set of circumstances in terms of placemaking, not just in buildings and homes, but in the public realm and the public domain. And really progressive places like Portugal, Lisbon in Portugal, are looking at planning for the elderly. Lisbon's pretty hilly, so it's looking at how people get around because their population is aging and their tourists are often older too. So the issue about aging, about diversity, the world is becoming ever more diverse by the week, and that isn't going to stop and change. That's going to continue, however much some people find difficulty dealing with that in different places. That becomes valid. How do we engage the communities that are a bit more marginal or are not so good with their English, say, at this level? So we're dealing with that. And within families, within communities, within ethnic groups, within neighbourhoods, as this hotel tag says, everyone has baggage. And I came across this in Gothenburg, which I think is symptomatic of the challenge that we have in collaborative placemaking. Now, this wasn't the planning department's office, but it could have been the engineers, or it could have been housing, or it could. In other words, we tend to operate in policy and delivery silos because that's how the funding comes, often through government schemes. And we have particular perspectives. So we see things in different ways, often cumulatively, and sadly often influenced by the media, who want us to see things certain ways. So we might see things from a Dundee or Glasgow perspective like this. But if we come from Ireland, we might see it like that. It's exactly the same, but we see it a different way. And if we were coming from London or from Norway or Norwich or wherever, we might see that the other way around. So how we see things is important, and we've got to try and address this when we're dealing with involvement in placemaking. So my colleague, Jazz Atwell, who some of you will know and will have worked with, she is a sociology and psychology graduate, and so that helps me enormously because I'm able to work across a conventional planning, development, design perspective and include more sociological and psychological elements. So we borrow from Maslow and we try to understand the different communities, or the people in the community we're working with have different positions on this spectrum, from basic needs through to self-actualized at the top there. And when we're starting to look at green policy or arts policy or design policy, we understand that some groups are up there in terms of their level of aspiration. And I've just come from Freiburg, and you might think up there, that's where a lot of the people in Freiburg are. And it's true. It's a kind of southern German muesli community who are up there. For others, it's very difficult to shift to a different lifestyle in terms of affordability and so on, but they may be able to nudge up from grey-green towards light green. What we're trying to do is help people in terms of their lifestyles and energy use and so on. It's not simply about energy use, it's about the quality of their lives. What I would point out that in Freiburg, many of the people who are green and green voters now have become NIMBYs. They're well off. You know, the eco-greens from the 70s and 80s are now well off, and they're actually stopping new development happening in Freiburg, which is causing a housing crisis. But that's another issue. Having a colleague, and some of you will know who this is, it's not a father of town planning. This is someone from a completely different background. It's Carl Jung, who we borrow from in terms of different techniques. Particularly, we've used the one of active imagination, which relates to when our brain is growing and developing in that kind of 8, 9 to 13, 14 years. And we use tools like play, even for advanced adults. And that helps the collaborative process, because at that age that he was exploring active imagination and trying to understand what it is in terms of the brain's development, we would play doctors and nurses, houses, we'd play all the roles. We wouldn't just copy our parents' role and view of the world. So that was very important in approaching collaborative approaches to better placemaking and outcomes. So we use from different sources, not simply mainstream planning, and we try to think, who is this for? But it's not just us who has to get who is it for. The community, the retailers, the businesses, the police, the engineers, and the residents have to understand there's a wider perspective here. So we try to help everyone, sometimes using role play, understand those distinct perspectives in terms of who the future client is. And we do that through a series of stages. An early listening stage before we even approach any plan making. We do it through a middle stage where we explore and test the ideas and options. I'm going to pick up some examples of this in a moment. And then look to get towards a preferred plan. And only then do we get people becoming advocates and promoters of the plan, because they can see where it's come from and how they've inputted to it. That's it simplified, separating the conventional plan-making strands with the engagement and involvement strands. So the initial stage is getting the ideas out to articulate a vision and goals, and you know, these are really basic techniques, post-its. You know, who'd have thought they would become such a big tool? I mean, we now know people trying to do this electronically, but basically it's electronic post-its. So, but it is, anyone can write them. It's trying to empower anyone. The key is who turns up. And as we heard at the beginning, if people aren't going to turn up and participate, we often have to go to them or find means to involve them. So for instance, I can't go to that session, but I've got colleagues who can. And those young girls at school are able to input to their neighbourhood. But this is in a part of an English city where there have been riots, and there are all sorts of baggage and problems there. So the messages about how it works come out through them making third-party stories. So we use storytelling as part of the narrative development, not just of how things might be, but of how things have been. So the analysis and understanding comes out through different methods. We then involve different people. This is one in a different project. These are more about the methods than the projects. This is one where the business and landowner and developer and policy community come together and review things, and they try to work through together how things might work. So they're sitting reviewing an emerging plan. This is one of 4 we did in an interactive workshop. You might think that's chaotic. This was an all-women group. It just fell that way. And they started with all the community elements and built the housing around it. Another all-male group put all the engineering infrastructure in first, the electricity and the roads, and then they filled it in with the community. And the mixed group came up with it. It was a pure chance. Now, the issue is, the thinking of all 3 is what informed where we went with in the end. And it's that dialogue and discourse between different elements which helps create a better, more intelligent response. It is not the designer, the architect, the landscape architect, the engineer who is the sole arbiter. And together they can think, and this is where I think Sandy was alluding to at the beginning, how to go forward, who has to do what. And this is where a lot of our current work is at a number of stages, how they go forward together, not just leaving it to someone else, the local authority. And what we're doing is we're borrowing from what some of the leading cities across the world are doing on this. So Helsinki, Copenhagen, Malmo, Oslo, Vancouver, Melbourne, they're some of the exemplars you will know. They're doing this kind of work, but some of them aren't just looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead. They're looking 2 generations ahead in terms of demographic change and the infrastructure they require, such as Helsinki. Now, when we took this to Glasgow, they said, oh, we'd quite like to do this. We think this kind of visioning would fit in terms of our plan making beyond the horizons of the plans. So I'm going to mention some, and I know some of you will be familiar with them because you've either studied them or participated. But the Glasgow City Vision one wasn't a charrette. It was an approach to look long-term about where the city should be going, and it involved lots of study groups on health and economy and poverty, plus going out in terms of outreach to community groups, festivals and so on around the city during the summer. And we went out to old and young, and in terms of looking 50 years ahead, what we did is we often used tools to help people look 50 years back and how things had changed. We went back to even the councillors. We're talking about the dance clubs and everything they went to in the 50s. These are politicians who wouldn't talk to each other between parties, all of a sudden agreeing on things because of the way they could look at the past. And likewise, we used tools, in this instance, simply icebreakers around colour. What would the colour of the city be now? If it was just one colour, what would it be? And we did this with kids between 8 and 13. So they came up with that. This is what they would like it to be in the future. We did this with the politicians as well. I didn't show them this, and they came up with exactly the same colours. So the issue was not about the colours themselves, but that there were shared perspectives and insights across generations that we could use. So they couldn't just dismiss what the young children were saying, because they were coming up with issues about health and cancer and so on as being important parts of what the community might need looking 1 and 2 generations ahead. So we were linking through these themes generations, sectors, perspectives. It wasn't simply about colour, although we used that technique. Obviously, we used wordles and things like that because there were recurring themes and words, and they were not all about planning. You can see people, community coming out very strongly, but also transport and housing and those kind of elements. And what it built up was degrees of subliminal consensus, which are more overtly expressed in the formal working papers of this visioning process. But the community fed into that, and many of those themes we see recurring in the policy documents of the city now. Not just the formal planning documents, but the economic documents and the others that support it. So there is a kind of consensus there that different players have inputted to, and I think hopefully that process will be updated every 5 or 10 years and refreshed. So things like cycling and the provision for cycling, like showers and so on, was coming through. Older people said to us, Glasgow's hilly and it rains, why would anyone want to cycle? But the young people said, Kevin, you don't understand. It isn't like when you were a youngster driving around in a big plastic sheet that was wetter on the inside than the out. All the new kit, the bikes and the gear, mean we can cycle anytime, and it's great. So now, of course, the city is progressing with cycle lanes and beginning to catch up on where the Vancouvers and Copenhagens and so on have led for the last 20 or 30 years. Just on the charrette series, we were involved in many of the cycles, but the first one with Andres Dwayne in Aberdeen. In this community, we're dealing with a tense situation of people living on the edge of the city, exposed to the loss of green fields, indeed green belt, for a housing expansion, because Aberdeen had had so little new housing for the last 20 or 30 years. All the community with choice were moving further afield, 15, 20, 30 miles away. So the charrette, the process of drawing helped people understand what could happen. So the drawing was not simply a design exercise, it was part of the community therapy, whereby they could see what might happen, that there would still be greenery around and in the gardens and so on, that the roads could be joined up, and they didn't want this to happen until the new bypass and the new Third Dawn crossing were in place. Well, they're now beginning to happen, and people can see how this relates to other infrastructure elements that could be put in place over time. But for many people, this was very threatening until they could have the discussions around what it might look like, what it might be like, and how some of the elements within this could contribute to their existing community. So this is a dialogue tool. It's designed as a dialogue tool and helping people understand what is possible. And I just want to reinforce, these are exactly the kind of techniques used in Freiburg, probably one of Europe's leading exemplars, but it doesn't mean that it's without problems. You have to keep going, otherwise you get a kind of fossilization. The event is a one-off, and you don't use it as a continuing intelligence process with a feedback loop. And I think that is a risk situation for some of the places like Freiburg who are 5 or 10 years ahead of us. The Port Dundas charrette was one we did last year as part of the Scottish Government series, but it was different. It was the first one in Glasgow, and there were not lots of residents. And yet we had over 200 contributors over the 3+1 days from a whole range of sectors. But where we didn't have sectoral representation, we tried to help people play the role, contribute the thinking from a retailer or a resident or a local business if they weren't there. So we used students and others to help contribute those kind of roles and build on a lot of the organic change that had begun. And what this was doing was trying to use small-scale incremental change that had begun as a trigger for people to think what might happen next. this was a fanciful idea 4 or 5 years ago, but it has happened. You can go there now and canoe in the canal and do, there's a little bit of rapids that people can use. And that's what it was like 50 to 100 years ago. It's not that long ago. People are around who can remember that environment. And that is the same place, that's where those little kayaks are today. So trying to help people understand the change involved for us going out and seeing it and discussing it. It always involves trying to have some kind of shared perspective, whether you're residents, local businesses. Hardly anyone has gone out and looked at it together. You might go walking with the dog or running, but doing it together somehow stimulates an understanding of everything from the levels to the views. This was the first sunny day of last year, as I recall. I think it was about April. But it's the discussion. And the discussion, whether you are a resident, we had Chinese community in there, it's on the edge of the core Chinese community, whether you're a policy maker, whether you're responsible for the canal, having people hear other perspectives is perhaps one of the most critical elements of this kind of collaborative process. So the drawing is part of capturing the ideas. You can see the idea for a park at the top. And we use scenario planning a lot as a sharing tool and a testing tool. So those scenarios show that even though we had different starting points for what the future might be, they all actually had common themes in terms of identity and sustainable uses, longer term uses. So we were trying to get roughly into that same zone. And therefore that informed a more detailed drawing. So temporary uses, even though we may not get a park at the beginning, could we have temporary uses and an urban gym? Not just, there's the Panel Sports Centre there, which was just about to open. So how can we link those things up and develop them? And you can see how that informed the plan making through progressive discussion and review over 2 or 3 days. And that work is now going ahead, and I'm going to mention the other one which we've been doing with LUC in just a moment at Hamilton Hill, but you can see how the neighbourhood thinking and the links to the city centre. If you don't know Glasgow, this is the motorway, the M8, the city centre, and that's the area that we're dealing with there. I'm showing the plan and the drawings, but this was all about people. It was all about who turned up and discussed it, and the fuzziness of the drawings was showing that there wasn't a fixed answer. This was all being built up together, and people could object to this in the discussion. They could say, that's too high, or that's too low, or doesn't. So these are really captured, shared visualizations to present at the end. And that's the plan. It's not a detailed master plan. It's a framework of ideas that people felt they could subscribe to and endorse. So it's structurally elements that had connections between the new Sight Hill area, the canal area, the island, over the top, round the side. And people felt that it could serve their needs and there were possibilities. And businesses who were about to relocate out of the area thought, oh no, we could stay here now. We could see this is going to become quite a nice place to be. So the work on that is progressing. Some of you involved in the ANDS will have seen how the thinking on that is progressing just last week. And that's the plan, or parts of where the plan ended up. Linked to that, as part of the LUC LDN team, we were involved in the Firhill charrette. And the reason I want to flag up that one, it's another part of the canal. The canal, Scottish Canal is a long-term stakeholder who can work with different communities. And the benefit is that we can go out on site together. And in this instance, the LUC team very creatively included artists. NHS are involved in this one as a key player, alongside National Theatre for Scotland, but the artists' involvement was key to capturing cross-community engagement, not just of adults but of children, and the involvement of the children, so you can see the same process as we had before, the involvement of the children helped open up the adults. A key part midway through the process is when children thinking about what the canal would be like in 50 years helped the adults let go in terms of their thinking. The adults started to become more creative. And this is, Hamilton Hill's a relatively impoverished community compared to some of the others in terms of that railway line spectrum you heard. So you can see there, the children's ideas for bridges almost help the adults think, yes, a bridge might be possible. We might actually get a bridge. And a bridge, of course, is a key part of the plan that the design team have drawn up. Indeed, not just one bridge, but you can see here they're contemplating too. So that's the plan that the LUC team came up with, and that is progressing as a real live project with key partners there, not just the Council and Scottish Canals, but also the NHS and local communities there. Now I just want to finish, these are just parts of the artwork that finished on the canal, which was frozen when we did it, which is always a risk in February and March. But just want to finish on this one, because I think this helps us think about what these kind of approaches do. We used in the recent Aberdeen City Centre master plan process, which is led by BDP, a whole range of processes: workshops, youth sessions, formal exhibitions, outreach, city talks, which were guest speakers from other cities like Manchester and Gothenburg and Calgary, and a whole range of media publicity and online. But we got feedback on questionnaires. And over the 3 stages, from initial ideas, testing emerging themes and vision, to presenting an emerging master plan, and we had thousands of people involved in this. We have just finished this process. None of this is public, but I felt I should share this with you. So we worked through these processes, and people came up with lots of ideas, and there was a degree of consensus at Aberdeen, as well as, for those of you who know the city or from the city, a real split around things, particularly Union Terrace Gardens and Union Street, but a strong consistency. And we had a lot of workshops, particularly with stakeholder organisations, and this is what emerged. The people who came to the workshops, who were actively involved in discussing things together, whether they're for business or cycling groups or green groups or retailers, they had the highest levels of support for the plan that emerged out of the process. Those who came to the city talks, other city players talking, they gave a very high level of support too. We're talking 70, 80, 90% levels of support. The exhibition attendees who came and who could discuss things at the exhibition, they also had a high level of support, but not as high as the active participants who discussed things together. Those who only got either physical copies or online versions, who had no social interaction, they had the lowest levels of support. They were still high, they were still around 60%, but they were not as high. Now, I can't, this isn't public, it's not out in the media in Aberdeen, but in terms of the methodologies, I think that gives us a sense that not only is collaborative design helping placemaking, safe being and well-being, engaged and representative society, but in itself, it is a form of therapeutic intelligence. There is a feedback loop. People can see where ideas come from, what gets rejected and why certain things are included and connected up together. So that's really where I think there's a key story. To answer the questions, do the approaches promote well-being outcomes? I would say yes, they certainly contribute to, and certainly they can. What processes are suitable? A range. Don't restrict it to just 2 or 3 key methodologies or processes. There are always different ones coming on the scene. To what extent they should be seen as an end in itself? My starting point would have been don't, but actually in many respects, in part they can be beneficial as long as there is some delivery and some reason for getting involved. So not as a rule, but somehow they can perform a role in themselves. What evidence is there of emergent consensus? There is some, but diversity and innovation is always needed. It's not about one perspective and one view. So there is a degree of consensus, but it will never be 100%. 60, 70, even 80% is very good. We do need new skills and knowledge beyond our own health, environment, planning and design skills. We need to have this ability to promote, include and synthesize people, actors, data, and also we probably have to develop our own coaching and learning skills too. And I would say the best organisations and partnerships around the country and indeed around Europe are already doing this. So I just wanted to finish on this one. This is about coping with change, whether it's negative change or positive change or just the fear of change and what might happen. So if we think of change as managed evolution, that needs intelligent engagement to build a societal consensus and consent and approval. We've got to be allowed to progress to the next level and create the well-being and the comfort that a society needs to be able to accommodate and cope with that change. I hope that's been a thoughtful run through the key issues, and I hope to see some of you in the Birmingham Congress. Thank you.
spend a few minutes, a very brief presentation, and reflecting on some of the things as well that we've already heard this morning, and then I promise we will open it up and give you a chance to speak as well, and I thank you for your patience in listening to our speakers so far.
Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Eric Dawson. Normally at Architecture and Design Scotland, but currently on secondment with PAS, formerly Planning Aid for Scotland. There was a slight mix-up with communication about this event, and thanks very much to the organisers for allowing a presentation to be made. Petra was very keen that the opportunity to say something about PAS be available, and I'm interested in my health and well-being, so I agreed to come up and do it in her absence. So, how does this work? Click. There we go. Right. Okay. So, sorry. Yes, of course. I had a bad experience with karaoke, so I tend to. Is that okay? Yeah. Inclusive community collaborative approaches to placemaking are really at the heart of what PAS is all about. So, and why is that important? Sandy's already, several of the presenters already have made reference to Sir Harry Burns. I actually stole Sandy's slide about this. I think it's quite incredible, having listened to Sir Harry Burns' presentation, the biological link between the quality of the places and the ability of communities to influence their environments with the health and well-being outcomes. The fact that it triggers chemical reactions, cortisol, adrenaline, it kicks in if you have poor environments, poor opportunities to influence your environments. And that leads to negative health with hopelessness as a root cause of health inequalities. So yeah, very taken by that last point about, what's the point of subsidising the poor performing things? Why don't we get things right from the outset? So a design-led approach to get it right in the first instance. Don't pay to accommodate poor outcomes. And that's very important in a Scottish context. Can you hear me okay? I hate standing with these things. Is that all right? If I shout, I'll shout. It's very important in the Scottish context where really today, in Scotland, certain things are coming together. The alignment of spatial planning, community empowerment, and all of these things coming together at a time when the Christie Commission, which was referred to, spoke about how we provide our services differently, and the Scottish Government response was really around a number of pillars: place, people, participation, outcomes, and preventative agenda. And participative collaborative approaches to placemaking are really the way of getting all of this working together. I've had this chat, so I actually did a similar kind of presentation last night in Perth to a number of folk. And I think people are really engaged around this type of agenda because, from a planning perspective, they're looking at new ways of doing things. How do you engage communities in planning issues? From a community planning perspective, and somebody was there last night saying, look, we need to engage, we need to align these things. And from a community empowerment perspective, it's all part of the mix. So how do you get that happening? And participative approaches, places where it all starts to come together, where it makes it real. And PAS sees itself very much at the heart of this agenda. It's an independent, impartial organisation, and it really has three aims around empowering citizens, equipping them to actively engage with their place, to make informed decisions and choices, and to provide equal opportunity to be heard. In the planning system, it says here, but actually I think in broader systems as well. And it achieves that through a number of activities: providing advice, undertaking training, providing education, place facilitation, and volunteers. I'm very keen to stress the volunteering role, so I know that a number of volunteers here today. So Inclusive placemaking, PASS engages in this and brings people into decision-making processes in a number of different ways, and I'm going to refer to these headings as I work my way through the presentation. So, youth engagement. I know that Jenny's here and she's been leading on this, so probably better qualified to talk about some of these things than I am. But the INVI programme in my backyard is designed to get children of primary school age engaged in placemaking, understanding and thinking about their place. Similarly, the youth engagement in planning, it deals with, is really aimed at secondary schools, young placemakers, again, looking at graduates and providing opportunities to have practical experience in engaging in placemaking. Working with European youth exchanges, learning from overseas examples. And the Place Work Folk was a project that brought together young people talking to elderly people about their place and the legacy and the memories of that. So, intergenerational learning. Again, this has been discussed earlier. How do you engage with seldom heard groups, seldom heard communities? PASS has worked with Gypsy Traveller communities around that. It's also worked with other groups who don't feel as empowered to engage in decision-making processes. And the speed, successful planning is effective engagement and delivery. Again, Maslow hierarchy. How do you engage? The speed training talks about 3 levels of engagement: informing, consulting, and partnership. And it's really thinking about what are the appropriate ways of empowering people to engage across these levels. Just lastly, finishing on a number of practical projects where PASS has helped the communities to engage in their own decision-making processes. In the Isle of Rum, a master plan has been developed, worked up with the local community there. We've also done some work with Leavenmouth, with the Charette Plus process. Again, the Charette Plus, picking up on Kevin's point about working with communities and also tying into community planning. So to start to address some of these delivery issues, how can you get the community, instead of coming in and doing a charrette and then leaving town and having that legacy of a charrette hangover, how do you demonstrate that actually some of the ideas are being taken forward in a tangible way? And that happened in Leavenmouth, where we had a number of ideas and we worked with the community planning officers there to identify budgets and give confidence to the community that actually this was more just a talking shop. And similar things are happening in Dunblane recently, where we work with the community, again engaged in a number of processes, not to the extent, not as well resourced as the ones that Kevin was describing, but identifying solutions and mapping those and looking at how they can be implemented over the short, medium and long term, and who's necessary to have buy-in in order to achieve that. Again, a big issue about how do you generate the activity, how do you generate participation. You can go so far, you can host the events, you can do the outreach stuff. Jenny worked with the schools, we had questionnaires, we had various different types of activities, but again, it's quite a challenge to engage the community. I think part of the issue actually, for me, I've experienced, I've heard this a number of times, there are question marks about the term charrette. A couple of people said to me, why would I participate in a charrette when I don't understand what that actually means? So, I think that there's something in that, and I think that that's an important thing as we think about the community empowerment and the community planning angle, is that if we want this to be done right, is the charrette just a moment in time that comes in and goes away again, or actually we're talking about something which I think Kevin was hinting at, and I think which is inherent in the place standard, which is that this is about a new norm. It's a new way of engaging people and thinking about their own place. And so it's not just a one-off event, it's maybe actually an annual event. I was at the Leavenmouth event, and I happened to be an observer standing on the margins, and I got chatting to this guy who was, as it turned out, he was over from Germany, I think it was Dusseldorf, I didn't know that at the time. I said, what do you think about this? And he kind of shrugged his shoulders, and he said, well, you know, it's okay. And I was kind of taken aback, because I thought he was saying, oh, this is wonderful, it's brilliant, what a wonderful way to do it. It's just how we do things, you know. Every year we have a charrette, we have the city, we split it up in 4 parts, and then we have a 5th event which brings it all together. It's how you do things. How would you not do it that way, he said. And I felt rather foolish. You know. But I think the thing about that is that it's absolutely right to have all the policy, all the initiatives, all of the good things that are happening. I think this is actually pointing to a different way of doing things to engage people in empowering them, for the reasons that Rory and Sandy and others have spoken about, which is that if we do things to people, then we won't get to the place that we need to get. We need to be working with people so that they feel empowered and have confidence that they can take things forward in their own terms. So I would suggest a new norm, a new way of thinking about how we put this into practice that is just embedded as the natural way of things. So thanks very much for allowing me to make that presentation. If you speak to Petra, tell her it was 20 minutes. I agreed to do it in 5. So it'll be our secret, okay?
I'll ask speakers to come back to the front, and we've got some chairs for you, and then we can open up the floor to questions. Okay then, so again, thank you so much for your patience in listening to our speakers this morning. Lots of issues covered. So now's the opportunity for you all to have your say. If you wouldn't mind just indicating who you are, where you're from. We've got some hands up already. We've got some keen beans here today. Fantastic. We've got roving microphones from our lovely assistants as well. This is awesome. Okay, do you want to start at this side then? We've got these 2 questions at the top.
Can you say who you are and where you're from? No.
Hello, I'm Carol Stobie from the Royal Commission for Ancient Historic Monuments, working on Scotland's Urban Past Heritage Project. And I'm hearing about fantastic processes and examples of participation. They sound really genuine and exciting. But when it comes down to it, I guess I'm influenced by Leslie Riddoch's book, Blossom. If we have the largest units of local authorities in Western Europe, huge blocks of decision making that don't genuinely feel that people can participate in, and inequitable land rights and all that kind of thing, how do the speakers feel that we can genuinely do more than just have an influence at the edges? Because people are not going to come to things. They feel passive, they feel disempowered for generations. How can we actually have that impact without changing the units of democracy?
When we did the work in Glasgow on the 50-year city visioning, many of the communities wanted to go back to the previous borough status they had, you know, Maryhill and Partick and that kind of thing. Not all of them had previous borough status. But in effect, what's happening, a lot of the way that Glasgow is working, and it's hard for people to conceive of this, but it is in a more of a devolved way. This is for people who see Glasgow as a big monolithic kind of entity. So there are many groups now, partnership groups, I'm involved in 2 or 3 in the city, where in a sense they're bottom up with community groups, development trusts, whether they're land trusts or enterprise trusts, working with housing associations and so on. So they're often key players in very localised areas. So it can be done. And the fact that those can often bid for resources, not just nationally but internationally, as a kind of charity or community network, I think that also helps empower them and see their mutual interest. So we've even got what appear like competing housing associations working together with non-housing bodies and health bodies. This is the one I'm talking about particularly there is in Royston. So I think there is potential instead of having a stop, can't do, the legislation doesn't allow it, in enabling, and that community planning is about more than just the top-down notion of community planning, which was often not about community or about planning, but it's about coming bottom up. And I think being, as authorities, and I know there's a debate in the Highlands about this at the moment, as authorities have got bigger and bigger, we've got to enable these networks to come from the bottom and actually welcome it. And I don't see a huge problem in that, in the way that Scotland's going, in that kind of more open debate you mentioned.
Anybody else wants to come back?
Yeah, I mean,
Can I take one over here while the real going to market?
Did you? Sorry, I think you was going to
yeah.
come back. on that.
So just in quick response to that, I mean, that was kind of the point that I was trying to get to, is that we have to shift those kind of relationships, and it's just, I don't have a direct answer to it, but you know, many of the organisations we work in aren't participatory in the way they operate. And so there's a whole mindset change in whether it be local authorities or elsewhere perhaps, that in our university perhaps, that we can learn to do these things in more participatory ways. And that in itself can start shifting, as we're working with communities, can actually start shifting a kind of wider kind of move towards more inclusive decision making. But it requires quite a fundamental mindset as well, I think, shift to change in order for that kind of linkage between community participation and other participation to occur. So, and that's difficult. Whether it requires legislative change in a major way or not, I don't know.
Okay, thanks. Another question.
Danny McKendry, formerly of East Renfrewshire Council, the regeneration team, and now just in practice. 5 excellent talks this morning. Thank you very much for that. You don't normally get that across a whole day. One key question I think was really about both Sandy and Kevin, but you all touched upon it, was the natural stages that participation in these things go through. You know, the listening stage, testing, endorsement, advocacy, and I think a lot of concern that I'm receiving from communities that I'm working with is this idea of what happens next. Things are rolling along a conveyor belt towards a cliff, and they can either fly from that stage or they can fall off the cliff. And I think my ideas really are about, you know, what is the capacity to deliver? There's an appetite for it, but the appetite soon becomes famished if it's not met. So really we need to have resource and focus and work on that. How do we take things to the next stage? Because I think there's we've got a room of people here who all work across Scotland and work with communities who kind of starting to get this, and the widespread nature of the charrettes is great, and the work's going out. There's a lot of similar work, but it's where does it go? Where's it taking us that concerns me a wee bit, and certainly it concerns people I work with. It'd be interesting to hear what you say about that.
Yeah. What happens next? I think that part of the charrette is about working with the communities, and then part of the answer, certainly from a PAS Charrette Plus point of view, is identifying people in the communities that will take on responsibilities to deliver some of the actions. So that's been a key focus for the work that we've been doing, so that it's not about just identifying actions and a wish list. It's actually translating that into something tangible. So part of the Charrette Plus is about working beyond the charrette to sit with the local authorities, other funding partners, and members of the communities to identify what are tangible things that we can take forward, and then pass on that responsibility. I really believe that charrette is just a moment in time. It's actually the legacy of what that enables over time. The other point, if I may, just very quickly in relation to your question, I sit on a board of a transition movement, and part of our frustration is funding. So you get funding for short term, you might get it for a year, you might get it for 2 years, and then the problem is that it dies and they look for other funding partners because they've done their job with you. I really think that there's got to be a shift. I mean, we've heard this many times. I think there's got to be a shift in terms of how we go from to become an enabling, supportive public role. So instead of it becoming an entrenched, I over-caricaturize, okay, but an entrenched bureaucratic role, I think we have to make it easier. Part of our challenge in in securing funding is the hoops that you have to jump through in order to get all that kind of stuff, and the processes and the time, and you know, for people that are volunteers, and a lot of this stuff, the bottom-up stuff, there are volunteers. They don't get paid. A lot of them are doing it in their spare time. Another thing, sorry, I'm going on at length, but I've started, so I'll finish. A lot of these things as well, you know, community groups, seldom heard voices. Community groups tend to be, okay, no offence, but tend to be managed or dominated, maybe that's the wrong word, by people who have time and who are articulate and who are, you know, in a position to be able to take this on because it's an interest to them, and therefore they tend to have a particular set of values, and then they maybe have a particular set of pet projects. If this is really about inclusive, we have to make it easier for other people not only to engage but actually to follow that through. Therefore, we have to make the kind of delivery processes more enabling, and that is about accessing the cash. Now, whether that is, you know, filling out forms to get EU money or having direct hotline connections to people in the council. I was really impressed with Tina Sabi in Copenhagen. She's the city architect in Copenhagen, and they have a policy where it's a can-do attitude. A member of the public phones up with an idea, we will make it happen. You know, no idea is a bad idea. Come and give us your ideas, and we'll see if we can make it happen, turn it into reality for you. It might not happen today, but you know, we'll give it serious consideration. I think we have to move to that kind of mindset, that kind of mentality about making stuff happen. And that's not just because the crash. It's about, you know, making all of this real. It is about community empowerment. I do think as well, you know, the whole community empowerment bill and making it real. You know, at the moment it's a very diverse set of factors, but actually some choice projects to demonstrate how this is all being put into practice. I'll shut up.
Okay, I had 3 hands, we've got some more now. So 3 initially, so there was somebody, sorry, the first one was the woman at the back, please. Then we've got number 2 down here, number 3, and then there's a couple more I think which I'll pick up in a minute. So we can take those 3 first, please. The lady there with the glasses on at the back.
And we work predominantly with young gypsy travellers. So I'm going to put Eric on the spot a bit here, but in a nice way, Eric, so no panics. We've done a fair bit of work with PAS over the past 2 or 3 years, and I'm going to get to the point in a minute. It's the point I want to raise is about different practitioners and professions working together, how we're looking about what we term as free participation and true participation. So that's about people's, you know, people participating according to their own realities, if you like. And that takes learning from all actors in the field. So we've done a fair amount of work with PAS, and that's been about young gypsy travellers informing PAS's workforce and volunteers about, you know, their reality. But tied into that, there's been a lot of training from PAS workforce and volunteers, skilling up members of the gypsy traveller community around planning issues. And I'm just constantly trying to bring myself up to speed with what planning is, because it's absolutely massive. But it's a key thing to the community for obvious reasons. I'm sure we don't have to tell anybody here what the difficulties are for gypsy travellers when they're trying to get a site built, whether that's a private site for a small family, or the real engagement of true participation with local authorities and central government level in looking at planning, law and policy, etc. So basically, at the risk of this being an advert for PAS in Article 12, it's just an example of how it's worked, because when we've evaluated that with the young people that's been involved, the key thing for them is that they are more empowered because they understand the jargon, they understand the policy, and charrettes seem to be becoming the big thing now. But these young people, although they're just a small group of the gypsy travelling community, would feel confident to participate in these opportunities. But that said, and to go back to the resources thing, that needs to be resourced, that needs to be financed probably from central government, so that the whole community, not just gypsy travellers, but all hard-to-reach groups or seldom-reached groups, the capacity is there. Because if we're talking about unlocking social capital, to know the rules. If you want to play the game, you have to know who's holding the key to let you in the door, and you also have to know the rules of the game. Otherwise, your participation is meaningless.
Thank you. Can I, do you mind if I don't come back to you? Get another question?
There's not a question. I mean, I totally agree with the point that you made. The only thing I would say very quickly is that you spoke about the benefits of the gypsy community, travelling people community. Actually, it's a reciprocal thing. So the volunteers going in actually understand, have a better appreciation of the kind of the value sets and the issues that are confronted, and that in turn over time builds capacity. So I don't think it's just a one-way thing. I think it's a two-way.
Okay, there's quite a lot of hands up. Could I respectfully ask you not to give your own 10-minute presentations, please? Could we just have questions so that we've got a chance for everybody to have a say? There are discussion points this afternoon, so you'll have plenty of opportunity to share and discuss this further. So we'll just for the moment. So we had a question down here, please. That was number 2, and then number 3. We'll come to the gentleman over there, and then the lady behind after number 4. Thank you.
Thanks. 5 excellent presentations. This is a question that actually follows on from the point that was just made, really. A recurring theme of all the presentations was about power relations and how interests in the private, individual, public domain are kind of mediated so that we get a fair and just result and places that reflect that. Issues to do with distribution of costs and benefits, recognition, procedural justice and all of that. My question then is about how important definitions are in all of that. As definitions frame problems, and they underlie the kind of narratives and storylines that we use to gather evidence to do things. And a lot of that, I think, I'm Clive Mitchell, I work for Scottish Natural Heritage. A lot of things we do in the public sector are for administrative convenience, which might not reflect the way the communities see the world and the way places emerge from all of that. So I just wondered if you had any comments on how important the way that definitions are and the way that we frame these problems and approaches.
Responses to that? Brief responses?
I've got a very brief response, which is, as an academic, we love definitions. But actually, what's really important is for individuals to be clear about what definition they're using when they use it. And that goes a long way to helping address a whole range of issues. In terms of the point I was trying to make in the presentation I made was that it's the subtleties around what we think we're doing that matter. And are we really trying to change the status quo, i.e. the systems in which we live, or are we just trying to achieve a more efficient outcome in a better, perhaps a slightly better way? So that becomes fundamental. That defines how I think about it, if you like. It doesn't make it easy. But to me, that definition is important.
Peter Marshall from Perth and Kinross Council, and also chairman of PAS. Eric said, how do we make this the norm? And I think that's what we should be focusing on. I'd be interested to see the panel's answers to how we actually implement it. We've been involved in 5 charrettes, and we've had our own conversations at sub-charrette level with communities. They're very resource intensive. None of our 5 charrettes would have happened hadn't been for Scottish Government financial support. And just to put it in context, over the last 5 years, we've got 25% staff resources and budget. We've got another 50 million cuts to make in the next 3 years. How are we going to make this the norm with less resources?
It's not an easy answer, but I think the way to make it the norm is success, improving the success of it. And we're not quite there yet with it, because I think, talking about the charrettes, the early charrettes were focused on development planning, long-term processes that come out with pretty dry outcomes at the end of the day. But if we can prove success in terms of the efficiency around that, and we have to some extent, because we're seeing repeat customers when it comes to charrettes. We're seeing the same local authorities coming back and putting their hand in their pocket themselves, actually, to run the charrettes. So they're getting something out of it. But I think until we see communities that actually that this is true empowerment for them, and that they are able to take forward projects, that's what it will take to change the political minds at every level. And at every level, that's absolutely hugely important, especially when you're dealing with issues like participatory budgeting, which is something which local authorities have. There's a lot of potential there for communities to actually be involved in the delivery of services and of place too. So it is about proving success, and it's baby steps. I am nervous that people that the cynicism there is about participatory techniques, because it's very easy to be cynical about them, but you have to let them have a bit of life about them too. You can't keep reinventing them too quickly. We're in it for the long term, I think, really.
The lady there, and then I think there's a few more in the middle here, and then I'll go
Sue
around.
Harriet Watt University. I'm rather surprised. It's sounding very 20th century. Scotland, the beginning of this month, took a step to become a young nation, yes really. It's no better time for us to say Scotland is special, we have special conditions, and the people of Scotland must have a say in their own future. I think there's a couple of mistakes being made because we live now in a non-linear world. And I think using trending scenarios to inform things like this is probably not as beneficial as if we used far longer term views through, say, backcasting processes, where we got communities together and said, what do you want your community to be in 2030, 2050? Because we all know the way to get money for these processes is to basically be part of a project to make unpopular schemes palatable. So if developers want to put housing on the floodplains near Glasgow, they have a participatory process. If they want to build an unpopular ring road around Aberdeen, they try and make people think that they're part of improving it. The real issue is that for the cost of the Aberdeen ring road, we could have put free solar panels on Perth, Dundee, Aberdeen itself, and taken all the local populations out of fuel poverty with that same money. So it's a matter of having vision. And if you're going to have that vision, I've got a question.
Thank you.
You have to, if you want to measure it, if you want to manage it, you have to be able to measure it. So for each of the speakers here, what measures of well-being do you actually use when you're evaluating the benefits of one solution over another?
The measuring wellbeing actually is something that we're going to be addressing in the second symposium, but it's good to have this raised now. I don't know if anybody's got any quick answers now.
My quick answer is that we don't have it yet, but we're working on it, which is the place standard for Scotland. That is a product, if you like, which will focus on well-being and on quality of life. But it will not be definitive. It will be about conversations.
So what about the other?
Some of the measurements we use are the measurements that are derived from the participants involved.
Is that good enough?
It's not always good enough, and it comes back to that wider point that you're making, which is that you can work with local people, but that doesn't necessarily put it into the bigger picture, which goes back to the point that I was making, that it's actually the relationship between community and state that matters. So I couldn't agree more with the points that you were making.
So isn't this a point at which Scotland could get together and create their own joined up wellbeing measures?
Possibly, yes.
I hope you're going to come to our next one then, because that is what it's going to be all about, is about measuring wellbeing. So it'd be great to have your input there. Okay. There was lots more hands going up, so I think I might start clustering questions now, if that's okay with our panel. So yes, we've got, do we have another way? So we've got two in the middle here. If I take these two first, and then I've got one at the top and one at the bottom, I'll take them 2 seconds, if that's okay. Thank you.
Stuart Haynes, Director in Lemon Street, Scotland. We work to help communities improve high streets and just things like street audits. Just a general observation that the panel might want to respond to. Have we got too much policy and too few practitioners with the time and space to actually do this type of stuff? Are the champions out there in the local authorities just to make this happen?
Hi, Sheila Allen, equally well lead officer with Dundee City Council. It's actually following on from your question there. Some of the speakers alluded to the fact that these types of approaches weren't new, and I wondered if you developed any links with CLD colleagues, community development practitioners. This has been their bread and butter for decades, so it's interesting and encouraging that these methods are being adopted in different fields, but there might be a danger of reinventing the wheel there, I think. My other point was on measurement, and at a national level I've been involved in the development of the evidence-based mental health improvement outcomes framework, which was led by Health Scotland, and this identifies measures across a number of dimensions around factors affecting mental health and well-being. There's also, I'm here also with a colleague who is involved in another equally well test site in Glasgow, and there was lots of learning generated from that. And I just think there's already experience out there in the field that I think it would be helpful to connect to, and there's also frameworks that are available at a national level that may help you to build your own framework for placemaking.
Okay, I'll hand over to the panel now.
If community development, yes. We've been working, our last charrette was with the community in Tranent, where we're working with community development staff there, who are working with other communities in East Lothian, and it was excellent and logical. There was a lot of synergy, and also a lot of this is about cross-professional as well as cross-community trust building. So I totally support that we shouldn't be isolated, any of us, professionally. Too much policy, not enough practical people out there. I'd have to say yes. It's almost like we don't need more policy. People can understand it, see it. A lot of it's out there. It's been good practice. But there is an aging and often a very early retirement age cutting of many of the people in local authorities and some local communities, and accessing them, whether it's through community trusts. In other words, just because they leave a local authority, if they're the person, the go-to person to do things and make things happen, get them involved in community trust, as I've found in Glasgow and elsewhere, in a bid or some of the other mechanisms that are making things happen. But I would say more people who do things, and I don't actually believe there has to be a Scotland-wide or uniform approach. I think there are many Scotlands, having worked in the Highlands and the west of Scotland, the east of Scotland, north east, there are many, and they can have different approaches. We don't have to have a uniform approach. So yes, get to local people who can do things.
I just say, I mean, I agree that there's enough policy. I'm not going to say there's too much, but there's enough policy. And in terms of practitioners, I think it's about having people who don't realise that they could be a practitioner, actually. So it's changing the mentality of people in local authorities or in the third sector or in the private sector about what they can do and how they can be involved too, whether it's elected members, local businesses. These are practitioners in a way. And the other point about making the links, we're certainly within government. We think we've got a lot to learn from community learning development techniques, from early years, from criminal justice. So they're all feeding into a lot of the work we're doing at the moment too, and we're certainly trying to pick up on techniques which have been productive.
Just on the question of measurement, how we measure well-being, it relates to the previous question as well. As Sandy said, the place standard is going to be a big place standard is going to be a big part of how we take things forward, and it's a big test as well. And there is going to be Health Scotland are looking into the evaluation of place standards. So there should be an evaluation process. It should build on the existing frameworks. I'm familiar with the mental health outcomes, etc. But that process we've still to go through, but it's going to lead us to think about how we actually are going to measure success, because the place standard being used is not the success, it's actually what comes of that and what outcomes we look at, how we actually measure them. So I don't have an answer, but it's certainly something that's a key part of what the place standard is trying to do.
Can I just say that on the too much policy, yeah, there's too much policy. All Sandy's stuff is good, but the rest of it. But the thing about the policy thing is that you get policy from different drivers, architecture in place, and you get health. I actually think the place standard is a good example of bringing policies together to kind of target things. And the thing about, and therefore that leads on to the second thing about practical people. There's no point about having policies that talk about holistic, integrative working if people have come out with a silo discipline or a silo budget or a silo mentality. I think what we're talking about here is actually kind of different skill sets. The ability to kind of draw on expertise to engage people from seldom heard groups, and a wide variety of backgrounds, you know, with an eye to delivery, you know, and that's a wide range of set of skill sets. So definitely, you know, policy is great. Scotland's in a brilliant place at the moment. You know, we've got great policies, brilliant policies, and am I sitting nice time? No, in all seriousness, and that lady's point, you know, about Scotland and the election and devolution and engaged communities, you know, where would you rather be? You know, it's fantastic. It's now about making it happen, and you know, the message I think from on high is go out and do it. You know, so practical people, yeah, and it's not about practical people up here. It's practical people in communities getting funding. Stuff.
I don't want anybody to go out and do it just yet, though, if you wouldn't mind just sitting around taking a little
If I
bit
could
of
sort of add into, I think there's a whole, the last three questions, there's a bit kind of in the middle that comes to my mind about the role of kind of academia in this as well. And it's incredibly hard to get, to get funding to do projects where we can do stuff as well as research it, right? So we need projects that we can research. But there was the Joseph Rowntree Foundation project that we've got. It's not a huge amount of money, but it was an incredibly unique call for funding, which was basically say, go out and design and learn how to do a process and kind of research it on the side. So it's kind of like 70% doing and sort of 30% kind of research in a way. And what that's allowed us to do is we've got a, this comes back to your practitioner kind of thing, we've actually employed a project officer who is going to be completely and utterly embedded in the Scottish Borders Council. So we're employing them, but they're there, and they're actually doing stuff, and then there's a few academics around that kind of collecting information. And all around that is there's this problem that we have where we separate this notion of what, you know, what is the knowledge that comes from academia. The tradition is go in, collect some data, and all the learning goes to the academics and sits in an academic paper somewhere that nobody kind of wants to read. And that's separate from this notion of the knowledge that is gained from doing, the practitioner's knowledge. It's called phronesis. It's this kind of embedded knowledge that comes out from having years of experience of doing something. And there's a real fundamental problem in that separation, and it goes all the way down to what we fund for research and what we can actually do to link with all sorts of indicators and learn about that and so on. And so there's some kind of fundamental changes that need to happen at that kind of level as well.
I think just if I can abuse my position and same thing about separation, I think as well we ought to be very clear about separating the things that can impact on a person's well-being and their actual well-being. There's a lot of assumptions that if we this affects well-being, so if we change this, everybody's going to make everybody better. It doesn't always work like that. So I think, you know, we're moving into the next symposium discussion, so we'll try and leave that there. Now there was two questions. There was one very at top, and yeah, if you can take that one, and I'll take Ed's down here as well. And I think I've just seen another hand go up. So no, the lady at the very, very top has been very patiently waiting for some time. She's right at the very top back there. Sorry, we'll come back to you in a second.
Three pointed questions really. It's Marion Williams from the Coding Association, Edinburgh Civic Trust. I was going to ask Sandy what the cure might be for the unwell-being of charrette fatigue. I was going to say to Kevin that, as usual, very compelling, but you need to convince me that you're not a master of manipulation, getting people to building the green belt, taking change as a given, drive for economic but unsustainable development that we are getting from government. You know, how are you going to deal with that with communities without manipulating them? And Rory, with regards to inequality, you know, the middle classes, dare I say, speaking for everybody else, it was a problem in Vicar, it's a problem in Freiburg, I'm sure there's places across Scotland. What do we do about that?
Thank you. Zan?
Thanks very much. Thanks, Ed Hall, University of Dundee. It's kind of a related question to the one we just had, which is about notions of making people aware of the wider political decisions that are made above their heads, which they're then being asked to be engaged with, that connection about the green belt there and housing. And then secondly, about responsibility, about making, how important is it to make people aware of where their responsibilities lie as in community members. So getting people to do things in communities is great, but are they aware that actually some of what they're doing maybe is a responsibility of others through the sort of authority, other parts of the state and so on. So although participation is fantastic, involving people in making decisions is great, it's always crucial to make people fully aware of the context within which they are participating. What are the limits of their responsibilities, and what are the wider processes that are going on?
Great, so 2 questions then, some of the challenges. So can we go through the panel for the responses to those?
I think the first one was about charrette fatigue and how to overcome that. I think charrettes themselves, or any participatory process, needs to become more of a delivery process rather than visioning. I think that's where we'd like to see it go, moving away from planning, certainly spatial planning, towards more community planning, and to become part of a co-production model. What that requires, I think, is a different approach to budgeting and a longer-term approach to budgeting. But I think moving away from visioning towards delivery is important. Put your crayons away is what we hear quite a lot at charrettes, and I have some sympathy for that if we don't see the products of it.
Kevin, there's a question.
I think the potential risk of manipulation is huge, and that when it happens, and it's happened in some communities, sometimes it's the same piece of land that repeats over generations. The loss of confidence and trust in the whole process, in planning and so on, grows, because it can't be static. It either improves or it goes downwards. In our role, we often, and I've worked with many people in the room, we often have to play a neutral role as a kind of adjudicator or honest broker. And we've often got to say to the designers and the policymakers, unless it comes from the community, it's not a valid part of the process. I think the one you're alluding to in Aberdeen was part of it was coming out of policy, and it was in the SSCI programme of the Scottish Government, which was different from, I understand, the one in Edinburgh, which was far more contentious. And there was a problem with Aberdeen not releasing land, and they were losing population and well-being. So there was a bigger issue that could be discussed openly with the community. In other words, they said, here are the choices, and often you've got to put the community in the role of counsellors or arbiters and let them see all the issues. Because I think only by learning and getting them beyond, any of us, beyond our narrow perspectives of, I'm a cyclist, or I'm the Green Lobby, or I'm interested in more people to my shop, or whatever it is, by getting all of us to think we can grasp the wider issues. And I think that's what, whether it's a charrette or a process, charrette light or charrette heavy or whatever it may be, and they don't all have to have drawings. The benefit of the drawings is that the drawings are a moment in time, and one can see how they evolve and track them, and they're part of a dialogue. So the crayon bit is actually quite useful, because not everyone is left brain-sided. Being able to jump right and left brain is helpful for lots and lots of different people. So we do see the drawing as part of the process, but we don't always see the drawing in itself as an end. But I think building up trust is, I don't think any of what we're talking about would work if it didn't somehow build up trust at different levels, at local, at village, at neighbourhood. Once the trust is gone, it takes maybe up to a generation to retrieve it.
And Laura, I think there's a question for you.
Sure. The question of the people who are relatively affluent, have a relatively large amount of power to begin with, kind of dominating and speaking for everyone else, it is a big challenge, and it's not going to go away. I guess there are different ways to approach it in terms of which communities are supported, which communities we work with to try and achieve outcomes. There's a role for CPPs, there's a role for looking at the data to try and identify which communities are actually going to benefit most from a process. And although, as we've heard, the resources are not abundant, being able to target resources that we do have in terms of financial support for action, in terms of support to set in place some of these processes to the communities who would stand to benefit the most, where there's high levels of deprivation and opportunity for that to be tackled through action and placemaking, I think is very important. In terms of sort of within communities, it's probably important to look at different stages. So there's the question of who's involved, then there's the question of what happens as a result of that, and who ultimately benefits. And
I think, again, evaluation is something that's very important, and learning as we go along when we do things. And I'm thinking, of course, about the place standards, that's a big focus, but learning from what happens when we put that in place, and looking at who, not just who's involved, but who ultimately benefits, will be hugely useful. And obviously being involved in the process, as we've heard, has benefits, but if things change which benefit people who weren't involved in the process, then that's a positive thing as well. So there's not really a solution to that challenge, but there are perhaps things we can do to try and keep that issue to a minimum, and try and make sure that the people who are most at need benefit the most.
I think your question was it about managing expectations, understanding roles, responsibilities?
Yeah, and as, it was about people being aware of where responsibilities lie, and I suppose as an opportunity, just an added point there, which we've heard a lot. There seems to be an emphasis, and I understand why, on consensus, right? Building consensus with communities. How about anything about resistance or about conflict? And so, what I mean by that, I'm being a little bit, I suppose, provocative here. What do you do with people, communities, who just say no, and we want something different to this, when you've got a certain proposal coming from government or whatever it is? Is it all just trying to... Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Can I come in? Sorry. Wider sense of wider responsibility. What I've experienced is that charrettes, I like the idea that charrette is a kind of a therapy, because what tends to happen is that it provokes a whole lot of short-term, immediate, small stuff, and that business about the longer-term aspiration aligned to policy, so low carbon future, health and inequality, all that kind of stuff. So I think that charrettes work well when there is a sounding, a gathering, and a stimulus. There needs to be a kind of provocation. I think the charrettes work well when there is an immediacy and there's a longer term idea. I think charrettes work well when there's an idea that the people that are engaging in the charrette are talking about the legacy that they are leaving for their future generations. And I think it works well when you, as it were, get to this kind of informed decision making. So you might be able to achieve what you want to do here and now, but actually the longer term consequences of this are maybe not where we want to be getting to, either as a societal responsibility or as the community's aspirations. So it's a hard way kind of wrapping up an answer to your question, but yeah, it needs to take account of the here and now, the longer term, and the kind of the therapy, get it off your chest stuff, aligned to what are the solutions, aligned to the stimulus of what might it be.
The contested bit is hugely fair, because a lot of us wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't some kind of contentious issue, whether it's development, regeneration, where maybe not a power station but an incinerator or waste, it's always, there's a kind of environmental justice tension. Usually the wealthy articulate people are the ones who block anything negative happening near them, as opposed to the people who, they may be important, but they may have less access to some of that. And some of the most aggressive, irrational people we've met have been some of the most educated and well-informed, theoretically, people in Scotland, and we've also done some outside Newcastle that were hugely convinced. So I think you can't force consensus, but you can open up channels by which people could agree themes and issues and principles. So you try and, what I often find I'm doing is I feel like a negotiator in the Good Friday Agreement, sort of doing shuttling between room to room, helping people talk to each other. Because often certain people are going to lose out hugely and others are just wanting nothing to happen at all. They can't cope with change. So often what we're trying to do is help people cope with any change and explore the issues and options of what might happen in the future. So the bit about backcasting was really helpful. What we could do is go 15, 20, 25 years out and say, what if? And you're not contesting now, you're contesting that, and then say, all right, how could we make that happen? So that, I think that kind of helping people explore neutral space, often round a table together, and that sometimes they're not just neighbours who've got different views, they can be father and daughter and so on, who've got hugely, and they're very worked up, and they're very visceral viewpoints. And I think we've got to help that, but we're not trying to block and close people down. So that's where the kind of therapeutic skills and therapeutic approach come in.
I'm going to take one more question. The gentleman's been very patient in the middle there. If everybody can be very quick, because we still have to move on to what's going to happen after lunch, and we need to get that in before you go for lunch as well. So as quick as we can. Thanks.
Thank you. Stuart Cable, Programme Director for Health and Social Care Integration, NHS Education for Scotland. I guess my question is really about capacity and capability. I've listed some great things happening, and I think it's very impressive the amount of participation. There are 160,000 staff in the NHS, 190,000 working in social care. In order to address the issues of well-being and the different skill set that is going to be required, some of which has been described, is going to require a huge shift. I'm just interested in the notion of how the capability that the sort of participatory approach, collaborative approach, is being developed within the design and planning workforce, and also where the capacity has come from. The phrase that's used in healthcare is we're sort of rebuilding the plane whilst it's in flight. So we've got to keep doing the day job, and we've got to do something different, and it's where that capacity has come in. Maybe the design and planning process is different because it's perhaps on a more project-by-project basis, but a lot of our staff are doing the day job and trying to do something different.
Can I come back on that? Because I think that's a huge question. And for those of you in the university sector, there are many in the room, so much of the pressure on universities is linked to the research side, and chasing research funding and getting research assessment scores, is that the focus on that kind of applied learning within the university courses is not what it could be. We try to do it. I'm involved at Glasgow. We try to do it and get people actively involved. Hussam and I do it. We actually do it in other countries where we do mini charrettes, and we do it as a hands-on learning exercise for a week or that kind of thing. It's like a mini summer school where you can see young people in their 20s evolve their learning very quickly from a theoretical to a hands-on. I think it's a difficult issue, and I'm the chair of the Scottish Planning Skills Forum, so we should be further on with this. I think we've got to do more CPD, we've got to do more cross-professional. Some of the best people I've seen have been coming, either working in or coming from the health sector, so they've been working. I think those in the design professions and so on should be working with groups in that side of the community. So social, healthcare, not simply other design and development professionals. And I think we should be looking from events like this at opening up the channels of shared learning, because already I think we're picking up there are lots of things that we're maybe not doing enough or sharing enough together.
Okay, thanks. We've been over the discussion there. Thanks everybody for your questions, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to get around everybody that wanted to ask one, but as I said, we will be having more opportunity to discuss this afternoon, which Ian's going to come and talk to you about. If we first just thank all our speakers this morning.
Okay, so I'm going to do two things now. I'm going to remind you of the first set of questions that I introduced you to this morning. And I see that some of the people who are needing to leave at lunchtime have already begun to fill this in. Unfortunately, I forgot to give you one of the most important instructions for the whole day, which is when you fill in a form like this, could you use that handwriting that you use when you know that other people have to read what you've written? Okay? That's probably for me the most important thing to say to you today. I'd also like to say a thank you to the speakers who have talked to the questioning framework that the organisers put in the flyer for the symposium very, very clearly, and I'm very appreciative of that. And as I've said, I will position myself by the door so that anybody who is leaving at lunchtime, if they could hand it to me as they go, I'd be very grateful. Okay, but what I'd like to do now is to talk you through what we're going to do after lunch. Okay, so after lunch, at 1:40, we're going to ask you not to come back here, but to go directly into the discussion groups that you're going to use in the first part of this afternoon. And you can tell both where you need to go and which group you're in by looking at your badge. Your badge tells you both your room number and the group that you belong to. Okay? The breakout spaces that we're going to use for the group discussion are on the floor above, and groups 5 to 8, correct me if I get this wrong, Ewan, groups 5 to 8 are going to go to room 408, and groups 1 to 4 are going to go to room sorry, FO1. Okay, so FO8 and FO1. And
FO6.
FO6?
Yeah.
Is that right?
FO1 and FO6.
FO1 and FO6, they are fairly close to each other. They've only got one room apart. Okay, and you'll come to FO8 first if you come up the staircase, and the other one's just slightly beyond. Okay, what are we going to be asking you to do when you're there? Well, in your groups, we want you to discuss these 3 questions. You don't need to remember them, because when you get into your group discussion space, you will find that each group has been provided with one of these to remind you what they are. And we're going to ask you to work through these 3 questions. A very, very specific request to you, which is, as a group, can you spend 20 minutes discussing each question? By the end of the 20 minutes, we want you as a group to have identified what you as a group agree are the 3 most important issues that have come up in your discussion in relation to that question. At the end of that 20 minutes, you should have a sheet with your 3 key issues against that question that you've done on the flip chart. Okay? We'll then ask you to go on to the next question and the next question. And then at the end, we're going to offer you as a group 10 minutes where, as a group, you agree with your rapporteur what your rapporteur will say when they come back into this room. Okay? And during that 10 minutes, what you have to do is you have to produce a 4th flip chart sheet, which has what you think is the most important issue against each of the 3 questions you discussed. Okay, so from our side, what we want you to leave us with is 4 flip chart sheets. The first 3 summarise the key issues against each question, 3 of them, and the last one summarises what you think are the most important issues against each one. When you get back from lunch, you need to agree amongst yourselves who's going to be the timekeeper for you. You don't have to work out who's going to be the rapporteur because you've been given one, but you do need a scribe, and that's somebody with good handwriting who's going to write on the flip chart that you're going to bring back in the room and that your rapporteur is going to speak to. Okay? I should have pointed out before, when you come back in the room with your single flip chart with your 3 issues on, you've only got 3 minutes to talk to it. We have so many groups that we need to be very strict with the timing. Beverly has a very nice timing sheet, which I will use with the groups when we come back in. And all that I need to say to you is, and you're not alone, because I will be there to help facilitate, Ewan will be there to help facilitate, and so will Prasanth. And so if at any point you don't understand what you're being asked to do, just simply put your hand up or send a runner, and either Ewan, Prasanth or I will help you. Okay?